Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Kowalski house squatted low against the Arizona desert like something ashamed. Its single story stretched wide beneath a sky that pressed down with the weight of an open palm. I'd taken the house-sitting gig through a friend of a friend. 3 months watching over the place while the owners visited family back east. The money was good, the isolation supposedly peaceful. What they hadn't mentioned was how the house seemed to hold its breath. The living room dominated the center of the home, its ceiling vaulted high into exposed wooden beams that stretched across the space like ribs. The previous owners had left the structure deliberately raw. Rustic, they'd called it. But standing beneath those dark timbers in the settling dusk, I felt more like I was inside something's chest cavity. The walls rose 15 feet before meeting the peaked ceiling, creating a cavern of space that swallowed sound and gave back only hollow echoes. My first week passed quietly enough. I established routines. Coffee on the back patio watching sunrise paint the desert rocks. Afternoon reads in the oversized leather chair positioned beneath the highest beam. Evening walks along the property line where coyote songs drifted in from the darkness. The isolation felt good after months of city noise and crowded subway cars. Here, silence had weight and texture. But silence, I learned, was not the same as stillness. The sound came at midnight on my 8th night. A slow, rhythmic scraping from somewhere above the living room ceiling. Not the quick scrabble of mice or the occasional thump of settling wood, but something deliberate and measured, like rope drawn across rough timber, testing tension. I lay in the guest bedroom, eyes fixed on the darkened ceiling, listening to that patient back and forth motion directly over where I knew the main beam crossed the room. The scraping continued for perhaps 10 minutes, then stopped with the abruptness of a held breath released. I waited another hour before sleep finally took me, but the sound had lodged itself behind my sternum like a splinter. Morning brought the rational explanations that daylight always offers. Desert wind through loose roofing, thermal expansion of the wooden beams, tree branches, though the nearest substantial vegetation grew 50 yards from the house. I climbed onto the roof with a borrowed ladder, checked every inch of metal and shingle, found nothing loose or displaced. The beams inside showed no new scratches or wear marks. But that night, the scraping returned. And the night after that. By the 4th occurrence, I'd grown tired of lying still and listening. I pulled on jeans and crept into the living room, stood directly beneath the main beam, and trained my phone's flashlight upward. The scraping continued above me, but the light revealed only smooth wood and undisturbed spider webs spanning the corners. Whatever was making that sound existed in a space my eyes couldn't reach. The scraping stopped the moment I lowered the light. I spent the following morning exploring areas of the house I'd previously ignored, including the narrow access panel that led to the crawl space above the living room. The owners had warned me about the cramped storage area. Barely 3 feet of clearance, they'd said, filled with holiday decorations and old furniture. I'd nodded and promptly forgotten about it. Now I found myself army crawling through dust and fiberglass insulation, following the beam of a heavy flashlight through a maze of wooden joists and ductwork. The space smelled of decades-old dust and something else, something sweet and organic, like flowers left too long in water. 30 feet in, where the main beam crossed the center of the living room below, my light caught something that didn't belong. A coil of rope lay draped across the beam, perhaps 6 feet in length, its fibers dark with age. Not the bright yellow utility cord you'd find at any hardware store, but something older. The hemp was twisted thick as my thumb, and when I lifted it, the sweet smell intensified. The rope felt heavier than it should, dense with moisture it had no reason to retain in the desert air. One end was frayed as if it had been cut recently. The other end formed a loop. I backed out of the crawl space with the rope clutched against my chest, emerged into the living room gasping and covered in dust. The coil sat on the coffee table now, coiled like a sleeping snake, while I tried to process what I'd found. Someone had placed it there, recently, while I'd been staying in the house. But the access panel showed no signs of recent disturbance. The dust around the opening lay undisturbed except for my own tracks. The spider webs I'd broken getting inside had been intact when I'd started, some clearly undisturbed for months. That evening, sitting in the leather chair with the rope coiled on the table before me, I noticed something else had changed. The television remote, which I'd left on the chair's armrest, now lay on the floor beside my feet. I picked it up, placed it carefully on the armrest again, and settled back to read. Within minutes, the remote was on the floor again. I repeated the experiment. Same result. The remote would rest normally on the armrest for perhaps 30 seconds, then slide off as if drawn by an invisible hand. But only when I sat in the chair directly beneath the main beam, moved to the couch, and the remote stayed put, returned to the chair, and gravity seemed to bend. I looked up at the ceiling above the chair. The plaster there showed a circular discoloration I hadn't noticed before, a ring perhaps 2 feet in diameter, darker than the surrounding surface. It looked burned, as if something hot had pressed against it from the other side, or as if something had been rubbed against it, repeatedly, until the friction had stained the surface. The rope. The thought came unbidden, carrying with it a certainty that felt both foreign and familiar. The rope belonged there, had hung there. The house remembered its weight, its purpose, the way it had moved against the beam night after night, wearing that patient circle into the plaster below. I found myself standing before I'd consciously decided to move, the rope in my hands, its weight familiar despite our brief acquaintance. The main beam stretched 8 feet above my head, but a stepladder stood folded in the utility closet, almost as if waiting. I set it up beneath the burn mark, climbed until the beam was within reach, and began to work. The rope seemed to know where it wanted to go. The loop fit perfectly over a worn spot in the wood, settling into grooves that matched its circumference exactly. As soon as the weight transferred from my hands to the beam, the air in the room changed, thickened. The temperature dropped several degrees, and my breath began to mist despite the desert heat outside. I climbed down and stepped back to observe my work. The rope hung straight and still in the motionless air, its bottom end dangling 3 feet above the leather chair. But something was wrong with its shadow. Despite the overhead lights burning bright and steady, the rope's shadow fell at an angle that defied the light sources, stretching across the wall in a direction that should have been impossible. The shadow moved, not swaying, as shadows do when objects shift in the breeze. This movement was purposeful, deliberate, like a pendulum marking time to some hidden clock. The rope itself remained perfectly still, but its shadow swept back and forth across the far wall in slow, hypnotic arcs. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, looked again. The shadow continued its measured dance while the rope hung motionless above the chair. That night, I lay in bed listening for the scraping sounds that had started this whole discovery. They never came. Instead, the house filled with a different kind of quiet, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something waiting. The silence felt expectant, pregnant with possibility. I found myself returning to the living room despite my best intentions. The rope drew my attention like a magnetic pole, though I couldn't say why. I'd catch myself standing beneath it, staring up at the loop, feeling an almost physical pull toward the chair below. Several times I had to shake myself back to awareness, realizing I'd been standing there for minutes with no memory of walking into the room. The house wanted something. The thought came clearer each day, less foreign, more natural. It wanted the rope where it was. It wanted the circuit completed. But completed how? And for what purpose? I began to research the property's history, digging through county records and local newspaper archives. The house was older than I'd thought, built in 1987, but on land that had hosted previous structures. A ranch house had stood here in the 1950s, destroyed by fire. Before that, records grew sketchy, but property surveys suggested human habitation dating back to the late 1800s. What I found in a 1923 newspaper clipping made my hands tremble as I read. Local rancher reported missing after leaving note describing conversations with the heir and claiming his home had grown hungry for communion. Property abandoned after discovery of rope burns on main ceiling beam. No body recovered. Rope burns. I drove to the newspaper office, convinced myself I'd misread or misremembered, but the microfiche reader showed the same words in stark black type. The address matched. The description of the rope burns matched the mark on my ceiling. The house had been hungry before. That night, I stood in the living room at 3 a.m., staring up at the rope. The shadow had stopped moving, but somehow that was worse. It hung perfectly straight and dark against the wall, pointing like an arrow toward the chair below. The chair I found myself sitting in more and more frequently, despite my growing unease, because something was coming down the rope. I couldn't see it, couldn't hear it, but I felt it descending day by day, hour by hour, like pressure building behind my eardrums. Whatever the house had been calling with its midnight scraping, whatever it had tried to summon with its patient friction against the beam, was finally answering. The rope had become a conduit, a line between what was and what waited. I tried removing it twice. Both times I found myself replacing it within hours, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain or resist. The house needed its connection, and increasingly, so did I. My dreams filled with images of things sliding down from heights I couldn't fathom, things that belonged to spaces between spaces, things that whispered in languages that predated human speech. I'd wake to find myself sitting in the chair below the rope, though I had no memory of leaving my bed. The remote control no longer fell. Instead, it rose. I'd place it on the table and watch it float gently upward, defying gravity until it hung suspended in the air beside the rope's bottom end. Other small objects followed: coins, paper clips, eventually entire books lifting from their surfaces and hovering in a growing constellation around the rope's terminus. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt oddly peaceful. The house was showing me something beautiful, something impossible. Whatever was coming down that line brought with it a kind of gravity that pulled upward instead of down, that lifted instead of crushing. But gravity, I learned, was not the only law being rewritten. Time began to slip. I'd sit down to read at noon and look up to find sunset coloring the windows. Or I'd wake in the middle of the night to discover it was somehow still the middle of the night 6 hours later. The clock on the wall continued ticking, but its rhythm no longer matched the rhythm of my heartbeat. The rope was teaching the house new physics, and the house was teaching me. I learned that the midnight scraping hadn't been a sound at all, but a feeling. The sensation of something vast and patient testing the boundaries of the possible, searching for a crack wide enough to squeeze through. The rope provided that crack. Not a thing itself, but a relationship. A connection between the weight of Earth and the weightlessness of whatever lay above. The missing rancher from 1923 hadn't disappeared. He'd simply followed the rope to its logical conclusion. Somewhere in the spaces between the visible and invisible, he was still sliding upward along that hemp lifeline, still discovering what waited at the other end. I began to understand why the house had chosen me. Now, 3 weeks after hanging the rope, I sit in the leather chair and feel the familiar tug in my chest. Not fear, but anticipation. The objects floating around me have organized themselves into patterns, geometric shapes that shift and flow like living fractals. The rope's shadow has begun to cast shadows of its own. Shadows of shadows stretching into dimensions my eyes weren't designed to perceive. Something brushes against my face from above, though nothing hangs low enough to reach me. Something whispers my name in a voice like wind through empty rooms, though the air remains perfectly still. Something calls me upward with the patient certainty of gravity in reverse. The house isn't haunted. It's hungry, but not for flesh or blood or any substance the living world recognizes. It hungers for connection to what lies beyond the visible, beyond the provable, beyond the rational frameworks that keep us anchored to this single layer of reality. And I've given it what it wanted. When the ceiling creaks now, I don't clap my hands. Instead, I listen to the sound of something vast and impossible settling into the spaces above my head. Something that has been sliding down that rope for weeks now, hand over hand, descending from heights that exist perpendicular to height. It's almost here. I can feel its weight gathering in the air above the chair, a presence so dense it bends light around its edges. Soon, I'll reach up and feel fingers that aren't quite fingers brush against mine. Soon, I'll discover what hangs at the end of a rope that dangles into dimensions I'm only beginning to glimpse. The house has been teaching me to let go, and when the thing above me finally reaches the bottom of its long descent, when it settles into the chair beside me with the weight of impossible geometries, I'll understand why the rancher left his note about conversations with the air. I'll understand why the rope burns on the ceiling match the rope burns on my palms. I'll understand why lifting something means letting it fall upward. The house has been hungry for so long, but it's not hungry anymore. Outside, coyotes begin their evening song, their voices rising and falling like the shadows of sounds that might once have been music. Inside, the rope sways with the breathing of something that doesn't need lungs. And somewhere between the desert floor and the star-scattered sky, I sit waiting for gravity to remember which direction it's supposed to pull. The line is complete. All that remains is to follow it home. Story 2. The first time it happened, I told myself it was exhaustion. 3 weeks on the road selling farm equipment across Iowa's endless grid of townships, and your mind starts playing tricks. That's what I kept repeating as I sat in the parking lot of the Comfort Inn in Cedar Rapids, engine ticking in the pre-dawn silence, staring at the corn kernel I'd just pried from the rubber band of my watch. It was still damp. The memory felt too sharp, too real for a hallucination. Highway 380 north of Cedar Rapids, 2:17 a.m. according to the dashboard clock. I'd been fighting sleep for the last 20 miles when my headlights caught something impossible. A wall of corn stretched across both lanes, perfect and vertical, as if someone had transplanted an entire section of field directly onto the asphalt. Not fallen stalks or debris from a truck. Standing corn, 8 feet tall, roots and all, soil still clinging to the root balls like dark wounds. I'd slammed the brakes, but momentum carried me forward. The wall had no give. My sedan punched through it like driving through a living curtain. Leaves and husks exploded across the windshield, and I felt the unmistakable scrape of stalks against the doors, the roof, the bumper. The sound was organic, wet, like fingernails dragging across metal. In my rearview mirror, I watched the opening seal itself. The corn folded back together like fabric, leaving the highway empty and normal, as if nothing had happened. But the evidence sat in my palm now. One perfect kernel, yellow, white, and swollen with moisture that should have dried hours ago. I dropped it in the motel's parking lot and went inside, but sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that sound. The whisper of leaves, the wet tear of stalks breaking. When morning arrived, I checked the car. No scratches, no dents. The paint gleamed showroom perfect under the fluorescent lights of the Quick Star where I stopped for coffee. The hotel's maintenance man was replacing the air conditioning filter in my room when I returned from breakfast. Inside the old filter, pressed between the pleated paper folds, were dozens of corn silk strands and fragments of dry husk. "Weird," he muttered, shaking his head. "Never seen anything like this before. Must be coming from outside somehow." I wanted to ask how corn silk could travel through a sealed HVAC system, but I was already gathering my things, eager to put distance between myself and whatever was happening here. The next few days passed normally. I made my scheduled stops in Waterloo, Mason City, Fort Dodge. Farmers discussed crop yields and equipment needs with the same practical certainty they'd shown for the past 15 years I'd been working this territory. Everything felt solid, real, grounded in the familiar rhythms of commerce and routine. Then the GPS started acting up. It began subtly. Instead of directing me along Highway 20 toward my appointment in Carroll, the device routed me north onto County Road B60, a narrow blacktop that wound between endless cornfields. I'd been driving these roads long enough to know it was wrong. B60 would add 20 minutes to my trip. I canceled the route and re-entered my destination. The GPS recalculated, then immediately directed me back to B60. "Damn thing's broken," I muttered, pulling over to reset it. But when the screen flickered back to life, a message appeared that made my hands freeze on the steering wheel. "Fileira, 19, Cole Aqui." The words were Portuguese, I realized after a moment of staring. I'd picked up enough Spanish working the southwestern territories to recognize the similarity. Row 19, harvest here. But that was impossible. The device was a standard Garmin, programmed for American English. I turned the GPS off and drove using the road signs, but the unease followed me like a passenger I couldn't shake. That evening, in a motel outside of Denison, I called the manufacturer's tech support. After 20 minutes of troubleshooting, the technician concluded the device was functioning normally. Sometimes there's interference from agricultural equipment, she explained. GPS signals can get corrupted by powerful radio transmitters. You might see strange displays or incorrect routing in farming areas. It was a rational explanation, one I desperately wanted to believe. But 3 days later, driving south on Highway 71 toward Red Oak, it happened again. This time the message was in English. Row 47. Time to turn the GPS was directing me onto a gravel road that disappeared into a wall of corn so dense I couldn't see more than 10 feet into it. I kept driving straight, ignoring the device's insistent recalculation alerts, but the display continued updating with new messages. Section 12, your late coordinate. 4H7, report here. Final notice, harvest protocol. Initiated by the time I reached my hotel, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the key card. I threw the GPS in the trash and bought a paper atlas from the gas station next door. Old school navigation, reliable, no mysterious messages or impossible routes. For a week, I drove using only the atlas and familiar landmarks. My productivity suffered. I missed turns, arrived late to appointments, had to backtrack when construction forced unexpected detours. But there were no more incidents, no more strange occurrences. I began to relax, to convince myself that the GPS malfunction had been the source of my problems. Then I overslept in Ottumwa. My phone's alarm failed to sound, and I woke at noon instead of 7 a.m., already 3 hours behind schedule. The delay would cost me 2 appointments and force me to drive after dark to reach my next stop in Burlington. I grabbed my things and hurried to the car, already calculating how to salvage the day. The engine turned over normally, but when I backed out of the parking space, the radio crackled to life on its own. No station, just static broken by fragments of voice. Row 19 complete, section 4 ready for coordinates matching established pattern. I punched the power button, but the voices continued. Agricultural reports, I told myself. Farmers using radio communication during harvest season. But the words kept threading through the static. Subject returning to designated route. Intercept position prepared. I drove faster than I should have, taking Highway 34 east toward Burlington. The corn was different here. Taller, denser, pressing closer to the road than I remembered. The stalks seemed to lean inward, creating a tunnel effect that blocked the sky. My headlights, switched on despite the afternoon sun, reflected off thousands of silk tassels that swayed without any wind. 20 miles outside of Ottumwa, I saw it again. The wall stretched across the highway exactly as before. Perfect. Impossible. A living barrier of standing corn that had no business existing in the middle of the road. But this time, I was ready. I slammed the brakes and came to a complete stop 30 feet from the obstruction. For several minutes, I sat there gripping the steering wheel, studying the phenomenon. The corn was real. I could see individual leaves trembling, catch the green scent of growing plants through my closed windows. But it made no sense. Fields didn't migrate. Crops didn't rearrange themselves. There had to be an explanation, some rational cause I was missing. I put the car in reverse and backed up 50 yards, then drove forward again slowly. The wall remained, solid and impassable. I tried backing up and approaching from a different angle, still there. I got out of the car and walked toward it. The corn was warm to the touch, the stalks thick and healthy despite being severed from their original field. When I pushed against them, they yielded slightly but held their position, roots intertwined like the fingers of clasped hands. The soil clinging to the root balls was dark and rich, still moist with groundwater. Behind me, a car door slammed. I spun around to see a figure standing beside my sedan, a farmer in overalls and a seed company cap, hands in his pockets, watching me with calm interest. He hadn't been there moments before. The road behind my car stretched empty for miles. "Having trouble?" he asked. as if finding someone examining a wall of corn in the middle of a highway was the most natural thing in the world. I gestured helplessly at the barrier. This isn't supposed to be here. He nodded thoughtfully, studying the corn with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent his life around crops. No, I don't suppose it is, but sometimes things end up where they need to be instead of where they're supposed to be. That doesn't make sense. Doesn't have to make sense to be true. He pulled off his cap and scratched his gray hair. You been driving through here regular-like? Every week for 15 years. And you've been keeping to the same route all that time? I started to say yes, then stopped. The GPS incidents, the strange detours, the missed appointments that forced me to take unfamiliar roads. Not lately. He replaced the cap and looked directly at me for the first time. His eyes were the same green as young corn silk. Sometimes when you've been walking the same path long enough, the path gets used to you, starts expecting you. When you stop showing up where you're supposed to be, well, he gestured at the wall. It might come looking. The absurdity of the conversation hit me like cold water. I was discussing agricultural philosophy with a stranger beside an impossible barrier of corn that had materialized on a public highway. This is crazy. Plants don't think. Fields don't move. Don't they? The farmer smiled, but it wasn't entirely friendly. You ever notice how corn rows always seem to follow you when you drive past? How they shift and align no matter what angle you're viewing from? Corn's been watching people a lot longer than people have been watching corn. He walked to the wall and placed his palm against one of the stalks. Immediately, a gap opened, stalks bending aside like a curtain being drawn. Beyond the opening, I could see the highway continuing normally. You can go through, he said. But it'd be easier next time if you just stayed on the route it chose for you. I wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to demand explanations for the impossible things I'd been experiencing. But the gap was already beginning to close, stalks swaying back into position with slow, deliberate movement. I ran for my car and drove through the opening just as it sealed behind me. In the rearview mirror, I watched the farmer tip his cap before vanishing like smoke. For the remaining drive to Burlington, I thought about what he'd said, the route it chose, as if the landscape itself had preferences, expectations, a will of its own. As if my 15 years of traveling the same roads had created something more than habit, a relationship, a contract I'd unconsciously agreed to. That night, I sat in my motel room staring at the atlas. Red lines marked my usual routes between cities, a network I'd traced thousands of times over the years. The lines seemed different now, less like my choices and more like a pattern imposed from outside, a maze with rules I'd never understood. On impulse, I grabbed a marker and drew a new route to my next appointment in Davenport. Instead of taking Highway 61, as I always did, I'd use back roads and county highways, breaking my established pattern completely. The next morning, I followed my improvised route faithfully. For 50 miles, everything seemed normal. Then the radio started broadcasting in Portuguese again, and the road signs began displaying impossible distances. According to the markers, I was simultaneously 20 miles from Davenport and 47 miles from Burlington, despite having left Burlington hours ago. When I stopped for gas in a town that didn't appear on my atlas, the attendant looked at me with the same green eyes as the farmer. "You seem lost," he said. "I'm taking a different route." "Are you?" He smiled and gestured toward the horizon. "Look around." I turned to survey the landscape and felt my stomach drop. In every direction, corn stretched to the horizon. Not the normal patchwork of fields and towns, but an unbroken ocean of stalks. The gas station sat in a small clearing, an island in a green sea that shouldn't exist. "Where am I?" "Where you've always been," the attendant said. "You just never noticed before. 15 years of driving the same pattern, feeding the same routes into the system. You think all that repetition doesn't leave a mark? You think the land doesn't learn?" I ran back to my car and drove in the direction I thought was east. But the corn followed me. It flowed alongside the road like water, maintaining perfect alignment with my movement. When I accelerated, it accelerated. When I slowed, it slowed. The stalks tracked my progress with absolute precision, a living surveillance system that had been watching me for years. Miles passed, but the landscape never changed. The fuel gauge dropped toward empty, but no towns appeared, no other roads, no signs of civilization beyond the endless corn and the narrow strip of asphalt that carried me deeper into the green maze. Finally, I stopped the car and got out. The silence was absolute. No wind, no insects, no distant traffic. Just the soft whisper of corn silk brushing against stalk in the breathless air. "What do you want?" I shouted at the field. The corn didn't answer, but the radio in my car crackled to life. "Return to established route. Proceed to coordinates marked on standard navigation system. Resume normal pattern." I understood then. The GPS hadn't malfunctioned. It had been trying to guide me back to my prescribed path. The strange messages weren't errors but corrections, attempts to return me to the route I was supposed to follow. For 15 years, I'd carved the same pattern across Iowa, and the landscape had grown accustomed to my presence. When I'd started deviating, it had responded like an immune system rejecting foreign material. But I also understood something else. I couldn't keep driving forever. Eventually, the fuel would run out, the car would stop, and I'd be alone in the corn with no way to call for help. My choices had narrowed to one. I got back in the car and turned around, retracing my path until I found a familiar landmark. The grain elevator outside of Muscatine that marked my normal route to Davenport. As soon as I merged onto Highway 61, the corn retreated to its proper fields. Towns reappeared. Traffic resumed its normal flow. Everything was exactly as it should be. That was 3 months ago. I still drive my routes every week, visiting the same customers in the same sequence I've followed for 15 years. I use my GPS again, and it guides me faithfully along the established patterns. Sometimes I see the farmer at roadside stands or the attendant at various gas stations, but we don't speak. They just nod, satisfied that order has been restored. I tell myself it was a breakdown, stress, exhaustion, some kind of psychotic episode brought on by too many years of repetitive travel. The rational part of my mind insists that cornfields can't think, that landscapes don't develop consciousness, that the whole experience was an elaborate hallucination. But I never deviate from my route anymore. I arrive exactly when I'm supposed to arrive, follow the roads I'm supposed to follow, stay in the hotels I'm supposed to stay in. Because sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through the dark heart of Iowa, I catch movement in my peripheral vision, stalks swaying when there's no wind, alignments shifting to track my passage. And I know that somewhere in the green maze that surrounds these roads, the path I carved through 15 years of repetition is waiting for me to stray again. Patient as growing corn, hungry as freshly turned soil, ready to guide me home. Story 3. The desert doesn't forgive, and it doesn't forget. I learned this 3 months ago at a festival I'd rather not name, in a stretch of Nevada wasteland that Google Maps calls uninhabited. I'd promised myself I'd stay sober this time. No pills, no powder, nothing that would make the experience anything other than what it was. Looking back, I wonder if sobriety was what allowed me to see clearly, or if clarity was the last thing I should have wanted. The festival sprawled across alkaline flats like a temporary city of the damned. Dust devils carved lazy spirals between art installations that defied physics and reason. By day, the sun bleached everything bone white. By night, the cold crept through your clothes and settled in your marrow, while above, the sky stretched black and starless. Not the romantic darkness of camping trips, but an absolute void that seemed to swallow light itself. I'd pitched my tent in the outer rings, away from the bass-heavy stages and fire performers. The silence out there felt different, weighted somehow, as if the desert were holding its breath. On the second night, as I sat cross-legged on a folding chair, nursing warm beer and watching distant figures dance around burning effigies, he appeared. The old man materialized from the darkness like he'd been formed from the dust itself. tall and gaunt, wearing clothes that might have been expensive once but now carried the patina of too many desert nights. His skin had that weathered quality you see in people who've spent decades under unforgiving suns, mapped with lines that seemed to follow some unknowable geography. But it was his eyes that caught my attention first. Or rather, his eye. The left socket held something that didn't quite match the right. Something too bright, too reflective. He settled onto the sand beside my chair without invitation, close enough that I could smell the sharp tang of metal and something else, something organic and slightly sweet. We sat in comfortable silence for what felt like hours, watching the distant revelry. The bass lines reached us as vibrations through the ground, making the sand dance in tiny patterns around our feet. Then, with the casual gesture of someone removing a contact lens, he reached up and plucked out his left eye. There was no gore, no socket of wet flesh, just a smooth depression where the eye had been, and in his palm, a perfect sphere of glass that caught the firelight like a small moon. He examined it for a moment, turning it between his fingers, then opened a metal box I hadn't noticed him carrying. The container was roughly the size of a cigarette pack, made of some dull metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He placed the eye inside with the reverence of someone handling a precious artifact, closed the lid with a soft click, and tucked the box into his jacket pocket. Throughout this entire process, he hadn't looked at me once. His remaining eye stayed fixed on the distant fires, while the empty socket seemed to regard me with its own form of attention. When he finally turned toward me, that hollow space felt like it was seeing deeper than any eye should. He spoke then, his voice carrying the rough cadence of someone who spent more time listening than talking. The conversation meandered through philosophy and desert lore, touching on things I'd never heard discussed at any other festival. He spoke of angles and perspectives, of the way the human eye could only perceive a fraction of what actually existed in any given moment. He mentioned something about the desert being a place where the boundaries between dimensions grew thin, where careful observers might glimpse things that weren't meant to be seen. I found myself drawn into his words despite their strangeness, or perhaps because of it. There was something hypnotic about his delivery, the way each sentence seemed to unlock another layer of meaning. As the night wore on and the distant music faded, his theories began to feel less like abstract philosophy and more like technical specifications. Eventually, he stood and brushed the dust from his clothes. He thanked me for the conversation, though I couldn't remember contributing much beyond nods and murmured agreements. As he walked away, I noticed his gait had a peculiar quality. Each step seemed to land slightly out of sync with the sound it should have made, as if he were walking on different ground than what I could see. I slept poorly that night, drifting in and out of consciousness as the temperature dropped and the wind picked up. Strange dreams flickered through my mind, images of vast mechanical structures buried beneath the sand, of observation posts staffed by figures with too many eyes, of satellite feeds that showed places that shouldn't exist. I woke before dawn with the unsettling sensation that someone had been watching me sleep. The feeling was so strong I actually unzipped my tent and scanned the surrounding area, but saw nothing except other festival goers beginning to stir in their own camps. It wasn't until I was packing up my sleeping bag that I found it. The metal box sat nestled between my spare clothes and water bottles, as if it had always belonged there. I knew immediately what it was, though I couldn't understand how it had found its way into my pack. The weight felt wrong in my hands, too heavy for its size, as if it contained something denser than glass. I should have taken it directly back to him. That would have been the rational response. Instead, I found myself examining it more closely. The metal had an unusual texture, smooth but somehow grip-resistant, like it didn't want to be held. There were no visible seams or mechanisms, just a lid that appeared to be part of the same seamless construction. Curiosity won over caution. I opened it. The eye lay cushioned in what looked like black velvet, though the material had a quality that made it difficult to focus on directly. But it was the eye itself that made my breath catch. Instead of reflecting my face or the morning sky overhead, its surface showed something else entirely. The same starless void I'd stared into the night before, but from a different angle, as if I were looking up from underground. I tilted the box, expecting the perspective to shift, but the image remained constant. When I moved my hand between the eye and the sky, no shadow fell across its surface. When I pointed my flashlight directly at it, the beam seemed to pass through without effect. The rational part of my mind offered explanations: special glass, fiber optics, some kind of art installation designed to mess with people's heads. But rationality felt thin in the desert air, insufficient to explain the growing certainty that I was looking through this glass sphere into somewhere else entirely. I closed the box quickly, and that's when I heard it. The voice emerged from the sealed container, muffled but distinct, carrying the crisp articulation of radio communication. The words were brief and matter-of-fact, delivered without emotion or emphasis. Angle confirmed. I nearly dropped the box. The voice had sounded mechanical, devoid of human warmth, but unmistakably purposeful. I waited for more, but the silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sounds of the festival coming to life. Finding him took most of the morning. He wasn't where I'd left him, and asking around proved fruitless. None of the other festival goers seemed to remember seeing anyone matching his description. I began to wonder if I'd imagined the entire encounter, but the weight of the box in my pocket argued otherwise. I finally spotted him near the central art installation, a massive sculpture that looked like a radio telescope made from scrap metal and mirror fragments. He stood perfectly still among the crowd of admirers. His empty socket turned skyward, while his remaining eye tracked my approach. When I offered him the box, he smiled without opening his mouth, an expression that somehow managed to convey both gratitude and something else. Satisfaction, perhaps, or completion. He took the container with the same casual gesture he'd used to remove his eye, tucked it away, and nodded once. His thanks came without sound, just a movement of his lips that suggested words I couldn't hear. That was 3 months ago. I've been back in the city since then, returned to my routine of work and sleep and the small rituals that keep modern life moving forward. But the desert followed me home. It started with my laptop camera. The little green light would flicker on at random moments, while I was cooking, reading, sometimes in the middle of the night. Tech support suggested malware, recommended a factory reset, assured me it was probably nothing. But their explanations felt as thin as desert air. The real problem isn't the light itself. It's what I see in the black screen when the camera activates. Instead of my reflection, the monitor shows that same starless void, viewed from the same underground perspective I'd glimpsed in the glass eye. Sometimes the angle shifts slightly, as if the viewpoint is moving, scanning across a landscape that exists somewhere else entirely. I've covered the camera with tape, but the image persists. I've replaced the laptop entirely, but the new one developed the same behavior within a week. The problem isn't with the hardware, it's with me, with whatever connection was established in that metal box under the Nevada sky. The worst part comes when I catch my own reflection in unexpected places. Windows, mirrors, even puddles on the sidewalk. For just a moment, instead of my face, I see that empty socket staring back, regarding me with the same attention the old man had shown that night. And in those moments, I can almost hear that radio voice again, confirming angles, reporting on perspectives that exist beyond normal human perception. I've researched the festival, tried to find information about the old man, searched for any record of similar experiences. The internet offers theories about government surveillance, extraterrestrial observation, interdimensional monitoring stations hidden in remote areas. But theories feel inadequate when you're living inside the phenomenon they attempt to explain. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night with the certainty that I'm being watched, not by hidden cameras or human observers, but by something that exists at an angle to normal reality. The sensation is so strong I can almost feel the attention like pressure against my skin, as if invisible eyes are cataloging my every movement, filing reports I'll never read. I've considered returning to the desert, trying to find him again, demanding answers or closure or whatever it is you're supposed to demand when your life gets derailed by forces you don't understand. But deep down, I suspect the answers wouldn't help. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed again. The truth is, I'm not entirely sure I want to close them. There's something seductive about being part of a larger observation network, about knowing that your existence is being noted and recorded by intelligences that operate beyond human comprehension. It makes the ordinary world feel small and temporary, like a stage set that could be struck at any moment. Tonight, as I write this, the camera light has been steady for over an hour. The screen shows that familiar darkness. But tonight there's something new. A faint grid pattern overlaying the void, as if the viewpoint has been enhanced with some kind of technical overlay. The grid pulses slowly, and I can't shake the feeling that it's mapping something, triangulating positions, calculating distances to targets I can't see. I've stopped covering the camera. Whatever's watching, I want it to see me seeing it back. Maybe that's surrender, or maybe it's the beginning of a conversation I'm not equipped to understand. Either way, I'm no longer the person who went sober to a desert festival 3 months ago. That person believed in boundaries between the real and unreal, between observer and observed. This person knows better. The desert doesn't forgive, and it doesn't forget. And once it's seen you, really seen you from all the right angles, you become part of something larger than your own small reality. The question isn't whether I'm losing my mind. The question is whether the mind I'm losing was ever really mine to begin with, or if it was just another angle being observed, another perspective being confirmed, another signal being transmitted to receivers I'll never understand. The grid pulses again, and somewhere in the distance, a radio voice is probably saying those same words. Angle confirmed. I'm no longer sure which side of the observation I'm on. Story 4. The house came with its own rhythm, and I should have recognized the warning in that. Old places in New England have their own pulse. The settling of foundation stones, the whisper of wind through gaps that decades of paint couldn't quite seal. But this townhouse on Elm Street had something else. A beat that didn't match the tick of my grandfather's clock or the hum of the refrigerator. It was subtle at first, like hearing your name called from another room when you live alone. I'd rented the place sight unseen, desperate to escape the cramped efficiency downtown, where the neighbors' arguments bled through paper-thin walls. The landlord, a nervous man who kept checking his phone during our brief meeting, handed over the keys with what I now realize was relief. He mentioned the previous tenant had left suddenly. Something about a family emergency. The way he avoided eye contact when he said it should have been my first clue. The ivory wallpaper in the hallway caught my attention immediately, not because it was particularly beautiful, but because of how it seemed to absorb light. During the day, sunlight from the front window would stream across it, yet somehow the corridor remained dim, as if the paper itself was hungry for illumination. The pattern was simple, thin vertical lines with small botanical details that, depending on the angle, looked like leaves or tiny handprints. My first night, I attributed the restlessness to new surroundings. Everyone knows that feeling. Your body refusing to accept unfamiliar shadows, your ears straining to categorize every sound. I told myself the 3 a.m. wake-ups were normal, part of adjusting to a different bed, different air. The fact that I always woke thirsty, mouth dry as cotton, seemed reasonable enough. Old houses are drafty. Maybe the heating system was pulling moisture from the air, but the shirt thing bothered me. Every morning I'd find my sleep shirt crumpled on the floor beside the bed, and I had no memory of removing it. I'm not a restless sleeper, never have been. Yet night after night, I'd wake up bare-chested, the cotton fabric lying there like shed skin. The first few times I convinced myself I was simply too tired to remember. But when I started going to bed in fitted shirts, ones that would require deliberate effort to remove, the morning discoveries became harder to dismiss. The smell appeared during my second week. Not everywhere, just in specific spots. Near the front window where morning light first entered, and in the narrow hallway leading to the bathroom. It was the distinct odor of hot asphalt, the kind that rises from summer pavement in waves you can see. But it was October in Massachusetts. The streets outside were wet with autumn rain, and the house's heating system ran on gas, not oil. I found myself lingering in those spots, trying to understand the smell's source. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was wrong. It belonged to childhood summers, to the hour before thunderstorms when the air itself seemed to sweat. Standing there in my rented hallway, breathing in that displaced heat, I felt a peculiar homesickness for a place I'd never been. The local library's records section became my weekend destination. I told myself I was just curious about the neighborhood's history. Every renter does that, right? But I was looking for something specific, following an instinct I couldn't name. The librarian, a woman whose bifocals hung from a chain made of tiny pearls, helped me navigate the microfilm collection with the patience of someone who'd fielded stranger requests. Elm Street had seen its share of incidents, small fires mostly in the 1970s and 80s. Nothing major enough for the front page, just brief mentions buried in the back sections. Kitchen fire at 247 Elm contained by fire department. Electrical issue causes minor blaze at 251 Elm. My address, 249 Elm, appeared twice, once for a small structural fire in 1977, and again in 1984 for what the paper called smoke damage following undetermined ignition source. The details were frustratingly vague. No mention of injuries, no quotes from residents or investigators, just dry facts that read like insurance reports. But the dates stuck with me. 2 incidents, 7 years apart, both in October. Both described as starting in the early morning hours. I started paying closer attention to my reflection during those late-night water trips. The bathroom mirror, an old silvered glass that must have been original to the house, fogged easily from shower steam. But even when I hadn't used hot water, a faint mist would appear along its edges, especially in the lower right corner. At first, I attributed it to temperature differences, warm breath meeting cool glass. Then I saw the finger marks, not handprints exactly, just the suggestion of fingertips tracing slow circles in the condensation. The marks appeared over my reflected eyes, as if someone standing behind me was trying to clean soot from a face I couldn't see. The first time, I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. The bathroom was empty, of course. When I turned back to the mirror, the marks were gone, but my own reflection looked strange. Eyes too wide, skin too pale in the overhead light. I started leaving lights on. It seemed like a reasonable precaution, though I couldn't articulate what I was being cautious about. The old house had plenty of switches, and the electrical system seemed solid enough. But every morning I'd find new evidence that my nocturnal activities were more extensive than I remembered. Not just the discarded shirt, but lights turned on in rooms I hadn't entered. The back door unlocked, muddy footprints, my size, my boot tread, leading from the kitchen to the hallway. The marks on walls and furniture started small, dark smudges that appeared after I'd illuminated a room, as if the sudden brightness had startled something into revealing itself. They looked like soot, but when I touched them, my fingers came away clean. The stains weren't really there, yet they weren't exactly not there either. They existed in that uncertain space between perception and reality, visible enough to photograph but gone when I tried to clean them. Each night I ignored them. They grew bolder. What started as random spots became deliberate patterns, streaks along the baseboards, clusters near doorways, and eventually, clear trails leading from the living room toward the kitchen, then to the back door. The paths were unmistakable, not random marks but purposeful tracks, as if something was mapping out a route and wanted me to follow. I didn't follow. That much I was certain of, at least during my conscious hours. But the unlocked back door suggested my sleeping self might be more adventurous. I started going to bed fully dressed, keys in my pocket, thinking that if I was sleepwalking, I'd at least make it more difficult for myself to wander outside. That's when the knocking started. Not on the front door. That would have been too normal, too explainable. The sounds came from inside the walls, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to move through the house like something trapped in the spaces between rooms. It followed the same paths as the dark marks, starting near the living room and working its way toward the back of the house. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. Sometimes it lasted for minutes, other times just long enough for me to sit up in bed and wonder if I'd imagined it. I called the landlord about possible rodents or settling issues. He listened to my description with what sounded like resignation rather than surprise. He offered to have someone look at the heating system, check for animals in the walls, but his tone suggested he didn't expect either investigation to find anything. When I pressed him about the previous tenant's sudden departure, he became evasive, mentioning something about the man becoming fixated on problems that weren't really problems. The phrase haunted me more than any of the house's nocturnal activities. Was I becoming fixated? The evidence was accumulating in my phone. Photos of dark marks, recordings of tapping sounds, detailed notes about smells and temperatures. To an outside observer, it might look like obsession, but the alternative was accepting that my senses were lying to me, that my own mind was creating elaborate hallucinations with startling consistency. The night everything changed, I decided to sleep in the living room. If I was sleepwalking, at least I'd be closer to the front door, farther from whatever seemed to be calling from the back of the house. I positioned myself on the couch with a clear view of both the hallway and the kitchen entrance, determined to catch myself in the act of whatever I was doing. I woke at 3:17 a.m., according to the green digits on the cable box. My shirt was on the floor beside the couch, and I was holding my keys. The back door was open, cold October air flowing through the kitchen like an invitation. But this time, I remembered. Not everything, just fragments, like trying to recall a dream that's already dissolving. The feeling of being pulled rather than walking, of following rather than leading. The sensation of heat against my back, even though the night was cold. And most disturbing of all, the certainty that I hadn't been alone. The marks were everywhere now, no longer confined to walls and furniture, but spreading across the floor in deliberate patterns. They formed a clear path from the couch where I'd been sleeping to the open back door, but they weren't the chaotic tracks of someone stumbling in the dark. They were organized, purposeful, as if choreographed by someone who knew exactly where they were going. In the morning light, I finally understood what the marks reminded me of. They looked like the aftermath of a fire, not the destructive kind that consumes everything in its path, but the gentler traces left by someone who had walked through smoke and ash, carrying pieces of it with them wherever they went. I spent that day researching the 1977 and 1984 fires more thoroughly, driving to the town hall to access records the library didn't have. The first incident had involved a young man, a renter like myself, who claimed to smell smoke throughout the house despite no evidence of actual fire. He'd become convinced that someone was setting small fires and extinguishing them before they could spread, leaving only the scent of burnt things behind. The fire department found him in the backyard at 3 in the morning, shirtless and confused, insisting that someone had been knocking from inside the walls. The second incident was almost identical, except the renter that time was a woman who documented everything. Temperatures, smells, unexplained marks on surfaces. Her notes, preserved in the incident report, read like a mirror of my own experiences. She'd also been found outside in the early morning hours, claiming that something in the house had been guiding her toward the back door. Both renters were relocated by family members. Both insisted that something in the house was trying to show them something, lead them somewhere. The reports noted no evidence of mental illness or substance abuse, just two otherwise rational people who had become convinced that their temporary home was attempting to communicate with them. I should have left then. Should have called my own family, packed my belongings, and found another place to live. Instead, I found myself standing in the hallway that evening, studying the ivory wallpaper by lamplight. The botanical details looked different now, less like leaves and more like small handprints, each one slightly overlapping the next, as if a crowd of people had pressed their palms against the wall while passing through. That night, I didn't fight it. When I woke with my keys in hand and the familiar pull toward the back of the house, I followed. Not sleepwalking this time, but conscious and curious. The marks appeared beneath my feet as I walked, warm spots that glowed briefly before fading to the familiar dark smudges. The knocking came from everywhere at once, not trapped in the walls, but surrounding me, guiding me like a gentle percussion section keeping time for a dance I was learning. The back door opened onto a small yard, nothing unusual about it in daylight. But at 3 a.m., with the marks leading me forward and the smell of hot asphalt growing stronger, I could see what had drawn the previous renters outside. The ground itself seemed to pulse with warmth, and in the patches where grass refused to grow, I could make out shapes. Not quite human, but not random either. They were outlines, dozens of them, overlapping and intersecting like the shadows cast by people standing too close to a fire. Some were large, some small, all connected by thin lines that resembled the burn patterns I'd seen in news footage of house fires. But these weren't destructive marks. They were preservative, like photographs developed in soil instead of chemicals. I understood then what the house was trying to show me. Not evidence of past fires, but evidence of past lives. The smell of asphalt, the warm spots, the marks that appeared and disappeared. They weren't signs of destruction, but of persistence. People who had lived and worked and worried and loved, leaving traces of themselves that couldn't quite fade, even decades later. The knocking wasn't coming from inside the walls. It was coming from underneath the ground, from spaces that had been filled and covered but never forgotten. The house wasn't haunted in any traditional sense. It was remembered. Every person who had called it home had left pieces of themselves behind, and occasionally, usually in October when the air grew thin and the barriers between past and present grew permeable, those pieces would try to make contact. I stayed outside until sunrise, watching the outlines fade as daylight strengthened. When I finally went back inside, the marks had disappeared from the floors and walls, and the hallway smelled like nothing more threatening than old wood and decades of human habitation. My shirt was folded neatly on the kitchen counter, as if someone had taken care of it while I was occupied elsewhere. I still live in the house on Elm Street. The nocturnal episodes continue, but they feel different now, less like intrusion and more like invitation. I've learned to leave water by the bed and spare shirts in the dresser, small accommodations for whatever part of me goes walking while I sleep. Sometimes I remember fragments of these journeys, moments of warmth and companionship that fade like dreams, but leave me feeling less alone. The landlord called last week to ask how I was settling in. I told him the house and I had reached an understanding, and he seemed to know exactly what I meant. He mentioned that the previous tenant had reached out recently, asking if the current renter was getting along okay with the situation. Apparently everyone who stays here eventually learns to negotiate with whatever's left behind. I've stopped trying to document everything, stopped taking pictures of marks that disappear before I can show them to anyone else. Instead, I've started leaving my own traces, books I've read left open to meaningful passages, photographs of places I've traveled propped against windows, where the light catches them just right. Small additions to the ongoing conversation between past and present that seems to be the true nature of this place. The house keeps its secrets, and I keep mine. We've learned to coexist with the understanding that some mysteries are meant to be lived with rather than solved. Every October, when the air grows sharp and the boundaries grow thin, I know I'll wake to find my shirt on the floor and my keys in my hand, and I know I'll follow wherever the warm spots lead, adding my own footprints to the collection of those who came before. Sometimes, just before dawn, I catch glimpses of the others, transparent figures moving through the hallway like echoes of intention, going about the business of lives that continue in ways too subtle for most people to notice. They nod as they pass, acknowledging my presence the way neighbors do when they encounter each other in narrow spaces. I've come to understand that the house on Elm Street isn't trying to frighten anyone away. It's trying to build something. A community of people who understand that leaving doesn't always mean going, that some places hold on to us as tightly as we hold on to them. The marks on the walls, the warm spots on the floor, the gentle knocking that guides us through the dark. They're all invitations to join something larger than ourselves. Whether that's supernatural or psychological hardly matters anymore. What matters is the comfort of knowing that someone, somewhere, is keeping track of all the small ways we exist in the world, preserving the evidence of our presence long after we think we've moved on. The house remembers, and in remembering, it continues. And every morning, when I wake to find new traces of nocturnal activities I can barely recall, I'm reminded that I'm contributing to something that will outlast me, something that will offer the same mysterious comfort to whoever comes next. That's not a haunting, that's home. Story 5. The Oklahoma sun beats down merciless on the abandoned Willowbrook Trailer Park, turning the aluminum shells into ovens that creak and groan like dying animals. I've been the demolition foreman here for 3 weeks now, cataloging each unit before the bulldozers arrive next month. What started as routine work has become something else entirely, something that makes my skin crawl every time I insert a key into one of these doors. The first thing you notice about the abandoned units isn't the mold or the scattered belongings left behind. It's the doors. More specifically, the locks. Room doors with deadbolts installed on the outside, as if someone needed to keep the occupants in rather than intruders out. The realtor's paperwork mentions nothing about this modification, and when I called the management company, they claimed no knowledge of any security upgrades. That was before I found the scratches. Every unit I've cataloged so far has them. Fine, deliberate gouges in the baseboards, all at exactly the same height. 22 inches from the floor, measured precisely. The marks run horizontal, clustered near bedroom doors and bathroom entrances, as if something or someone had been dragged along the walls repeatedly. The consistency unnerves me more than I care to admit. These aren't random damage from moving furniture or normal wear. They're methodical, purposeful. Unit 47 changes everything. The door resists when I first try the key, the lock catching in a way that suggests the mechanism has been tampered with. When it finally opens, the stale air that rushes out carries something underneath the expected mustiness. A faint organic smell that reminds me of a hospital room. The living area appears normal enough. Dated furniture covered in plastic sheets, a small television with rabbit ears, magazines from 2019 scattered on a coffee table. The bedroom door stands slightly ajar. I push it open with my boot, unwilling to touch the handle with my bare hands. The room beyond makes my stomach clench. The wallpaper, a faded floral pattern, bears horizontal marks worn into the surface itself. Not scratches this time, but smooth, polished lines where something has rubbed against the wall repeatedly. The spacing matches perfectly with fingernails dragging across the surface, and the height corresponds exactly to someone sitting or kneeling. The pattern suggests months of repetitive motion. I'm measuring the room's dimensions when the front door closes behind me with a soft click. The sound shouldn't alarm me. These old trailers settle constantly and wind can catch doors. But my pulse quickens anyway. I continue my work, noting the room's square footage and the condition of the flooring, when I hear it. The doorknob turns, not violently or urgently, but with the slow, testing motion of someone checking if the door is locked. The metal mechanism rotates 1/4 turn, pauses, then returns to its original position. Then it repeats. The pattern continues for nearly a minute while I stand frozen in the bedroom, my measuring tape hanging loose in my hands. When I finally work up the courage to investigate, I find the hallway empty. The front door stands closed but unlocked, exactly as I left it when I entered. There are no footprints in the dust outside, no sign that anyone has been near the trailer. I tell myself it's the heat playing tricks on my mind. Unit 52 proves me wrong. This one has the same external locks, the same baseboard scratches, but when I place my ear against the bedroom wall, I hear something that makes my blood run cold. Not crying or screaming as I might expect from a place that feels so wrong, but breathing. Shallow, rapid inhalations that seem to match my own respiratory rhythm perfectly. When I hold my breath, the sound continues for exactly 3 seconds before stopping. When I breathe again, it resumes. I press my ear harder against the wall, certain that I'm imagining things, but the sound persists. It's coming from inside the wall itself, as if someone is trapped in the narrow space between the bedroom and the adjacent unit. The breathing has a wet quality that suggests congestion or tears, and underneath it, I can hear the faintest whisper of fabric against drywall. I jerk away from the wall and the sound stops immediately. When I move to leave, I discover that the key won't fit in the lock. The deadbolt cylinder appears to have shifted upward by 1/2 inch, making it impossible to secure the door from the outside. I examine the mechanism closely, running my fingers around the edges of the lock plate, but find no evidence of tampering. The metal shows no scratches or pry marks, no indication that anyone has forced it out of position. Yet the lock has definitely moved. That night, I researched the trailer park's history online. Willowbrook operated for 15 years before closing last spring due to code violations and complaints from neighboring properties. The complaints I discover weren't about noise or property maintenance. They were about sounds coming from the park at night, voices calling for help, scratching noises, and what multiple witnesses described as breathing sounds coming from empty units. The city investigated twice and found nothing. I develop a routine. Before entering any unit, I knock 3 times on the door and announce my presence loudly. I state my name, my purpose, and the approximate time I expect to spend inside. Then I deliberately drop my measuring tape on the ground, letting the metal case clatter against the floor. The sound echoes through the trailer and seems to travel beyond its walls, as if the entire park is listening. After implementing this ritual, the doors remain open for exactly 15 minutes. No force closes them, no wind catches them, no mysterious hands test the locks from outside. For precisely 15 minutes, I can work uninterrupted while feeling invisible eyes tracking my every movement. But 15 minutes isn't long enough. The catalog work requires detailed measurements, photographs, and condition reports that typically take 30 to 40 minutes per unit. The ritual only provides half the time I need, forcing me to make difficult choices about which information to gather during each visit. I try staying longer once, ignoring the 15-minute window, and the consequences are immediate. The walls begin to respond. Soft tapping sounds emerge from inside the drywall, following me as I move through the rooms. The rhythm matches my footsteps exactly. When I step, something steps inside the walls. When I pause, the sounds pause. When I deliberately change my gait, the hidden footsteps adjust accordingly. The precision is impossible to explain through natural causes like settling materials or temperature changes. The sounds suggest awareness. Unit 63 houses the discovery that changes everything. This trailer has been modified more extensively than the others. Additional locks have been installed on interior doors, and the windows have been covered with sheet metal from the inside. The bedroom shows signs of prolonged occupancy, despite the park's official closure date. A mattress that isn't covered in dust, water glasses that haven't evaporated completely, and personal items that appear recently used. The wallpaper damage here is more extensive. The horizontal marks cover entire walls in some places, creating patterns that resemble writing when viewed from certain angles. I take photographs with my phone, and when I review them later, the marks seem to form letters and words in a language I don't recognize. But that's not the most disturbing discovery. Behind the bedroom door, I find a clipboard hanging from a nail driven into the wall. The pages contain handwritten notes in multiple hands, documenting activities and observations. The entries span several months and describe the exact phenomena I've been experiencing. Breathing sounds synchronize with observers' respiratory pattern. Lock mechanisms shift position when unobserved. 15-minute window of normal behavior following audio announcement. Wall tapping indicates awareness of presence and movement. The final entry, dated 3 days ago, reads simply, "The new inspector has arrived. He follows the same patterns. They're learning." My hands shake as I photograph each page, and when I flip to the final sheet, I find my own name written in unfamiliar handwriting. Underneath, someone has noted my arrival date at the park, my work schedule, and detailed observations of my daily routine. They've been watching me since my first day. The implications hit me like a physical blow. The breathing, the moving locks, the tapping, none of it is supernatural. There are people living in these abandoned trailers, hiding in walls or crawl spaces, observing and cataloging the demolition inspectors just as we catalog their former homes. The external locks weren't installed to keep people in, they were installed to keep inspectors out. But the revelation brings new questions that are somehow more terrifying than the supernatural explanations I'd been considering. How many people are living here? How long have they been hiding? And why does my announcement ritual cause them to retreat for exactly 15 minutes? I study the clipboard notes more carefully and find references to the arrangement and feeding times and rotation schedules. The language suggests organization, planning, and a level of coordination that requires leadership. These aren't random squatters taking shelter in abandoned buildings. This is a community with rules and structure and purposes I can't begin to understand. The worst part is the growing certainty that they know I've discovered their presence. Since finding the clipboard, the phenomena have changed. The breathing sounds now come from multiple locations simultaneously, creating a chorus of hidden watchers that follow me through each unit. The wall tapping has become more complex, incorporating rhythms and patterns that seem almost conversational. And the 15-minute window has begun to shrink. Yesterday, I only had 12 minutes of uninterrupted time. Today, it was 8. I should report this to the police or the demolition company or someone with the authority to handle whatever is happening at Willowbrook. But the notes on that clipboard suggest that other inspectors have come and gone, and somehow their discoveries have been contained or dismissed. The management company claims ignorance, the city investigations found nothing, and the neighboring complaints were ignored. How do you report people who live inside walls? Tonight I sit in my motel room and study the photographs I've taken, looking for patterns or clues that might explain what I'm dealing with. The wallpaper marks do seem to form words when arranged properly, but the language appears to be some kind of code or cipher. The breathing sounds I've recorded play back as static on my phone, as if the microphone can't properly capture whatever is making them. And tomorrow, I have to go back. The demolition schedule doesn't allow for delays or missing units. Every trailer must be cataloged before the bulldozers arrive, which means I'll be returning to Willowbrook for at least another week. The hidden residents know this as well as I do. They've been tracking my progress, observing my methods, and adapting to my presence. But they've made one mistake. The clipboard notes reveal that they follow patterns too. The 15-minute retreats aren't random accommodations. They're scheduled events that serve some purpose in their hidden community. The breathing sounds occur at specific times and locations that correlate with my movements through their territory. Even the lock modifications follow a predictable logic that I'm beginning to understand. If they can observe and catalog me, perhaps I can do the same to them. I pull out a fresh notebook and begin my own documentation. Tomorrow, I'll test new theories about the 15-minute window. I'll vary my announcement ritual and see how they respond. I'll map the breathing sounds and wall tapping to determine how many individuals I'm dealing with and where they might be hiding. Most importantly, I'll try to understand why they're letting me see evidence of their presence at all, because that's the question that keeps me awake as the Oklahoma wind rattles my motel room windows. If these people have successfully hidden from city inspectors and police investigations, why are they revealing themselves to me? What makes a demolition foreman worthy of contact when law enforcement officers weren't? The answer might be simpler and more terrifying than supernatural explanations. They might not be hiding anymore. As I write these words, I can hear breathing outside my motel room door, the same shallow, wet sound that echoes through the abandoned trailers. The doorknob turns slowly, testing the lock, and I realize with growing horror that the 15-minute pattern has followed me home. In the distance, barely audible above the wind, comes the sound of fingernails scratching against aluminum siding. They've learned my address too. Story 6. The sound came first, metal against wood, sharp and definitive like a verdict. I froze at my desk, fingers suspended over the laptop keys, listening to the echo die in the cramped studio. It was past midnight and Chicago's winter wind had been rattling the building for hours, but this sound came from inside, from the kitchen drawer. I waited, counting heartbeats, before crossing the room on sock-covered feet. The hardwood creaked in all the familiar places, a percussion I'd memorized during 3 months of solitary living. But when I pulled open the drawer, the metal candle holder sat against the right wall, not where I'd left it, nested among the takeout menus on the left. The thing had slid across the entire width of the drawer. Impossible, unless... I examined the drawer's track, running my finger along the groove. Level, no warping. The building was old, sure, but not tilted enough to send objects rolling. I picked up the candle holder, feeling its weight, its cold brass surface still holding the room's chill. Heavy enough that it would have taken force to move it. But I lived alone. I told myself it was nothing. Old building, settling foundations, a dozen rational explanations. I placed the candle holder back on the left side and went to bed, though sleep came in fragments, broken by the conviction that I was hearing things move in the darkness. The next morning brought coffee and daylight reasoning. Buildings did strange things. Metal expanded and contracted. Drawers could have subtle inclines invisible to the naked eye. I was a software developer after all. I believed in logical explanations, in debugging reality the same way I debugged code. But 3 days later, the ruler on my desk had migrated 2 inches to the right. I discovered it during my morning routine, lying parallel to where I'd left it, but displaced just enough to be noticeable. I stared at it for a full minute, trying to remember if I'd moved it, if I'd knocked it while reaching for something else. The memory felt solid. I'd left it flush against the laptop's edge. Now it sat in the dead center of the desk. The episodes multiplied. A soup spoon I'd left in the sink appeared on the counter, moved exactly half an inch from the edge. The charging cable for my phone, which I obsessively coiled in a perfect circle each night, showed an extra loop, a gentle curve that hadn't been there before. Each displacement was minimal, precise, as if something was testing the boundaries of my perception. I started keeping a notebook, documenting each incident with the methodical obsession of someone trying to prove their own sanity. Dates, times, exact measurements. The pattern that emerged made my hands shake as I wrote. Everything moved from left to right, always in small, deliberate increments. Never random, never chaotic, purposeful. A memory surfaced from childhood. My grandmother watching me struggle with scissors, her weathered hand guiding mine. "The world is made for righties," she'd said, "but the left-handed see things differently. They move through space backwards from the rest of us." I hadn't thought about being left-handed in years. My parents had corrected me early, patience and persistence training my dominant hand to be the right one. I could barely remember what it felt like to write naturally, to move instinctively in the direction that felt correct rather than forced. But someone or something in my apartment was moving left-handed. I installed a bubble level on the kitchen counter, the kind contractors use to ensure perfect horizontal alignment. If the building was shifting, if there was some structural explanation for objects sliding around, the bubble would show it. I placed it carefully, photographed it from multiple angles, documented its perfect center position. The bubble never moved, not once. The camera was next. A motion-activated security camera I positioned to watch the kitchen drawer. For 2 weeks, I reviewed footage each morning, fast-forwarding through hours of empty frames. Then I caught it. The candle holder, moving in real time, sliding smoothly from left to right. But the movement lasted only seconds, and always cut off just before it reached its final position, as if someone had pressed stop on a recording. The footage showed the beginning of movement, never the end. Never the moment of completion. Like watching a sentence that cuts off mid. I began to question my memory, my perception, my grip on basic reality. Was I moving these objects myself? Sleepwalking? Dissociating? I set up additional cameras, positioned mirrors to eliminate blind spots, even scattered flour on surfaces to capture fingerprints. Nothing. The objects continued their sinister migration, leaving no trace of human interference. The breakthrough came during a sleepless night in early February. Frustrated and desperate, I grabbed a pen with my left hand and tried to write my name. The result was illegible, shaky, childish scrawl that looked nothing like my practiced right-handed signature. But as I concentrated, forcing my left hand to move with intention, something shifted in the apartment's atmosphere. The silence deepened. Not just quiet, but the absence of something I hadn't realized was there. The subtle sense of being watched, of sharing space with an invisible presence, simply stopped. I practiced for an hour, forcing my left hand to trace simple shapes, circles, lines, basic letters. Each successful stroke seemed to calm whatever force had been disturbing my space. When I finally managed to write 2 words without trembling, left hand. The apartment fell into the deepest quiet I'd experienced since moving in. The objects stopped moving that night. But the peace was temporary. Within days, unless I spent time each evening training my left hand, the displacements resumed. A fork would slide across the counter. A book would shift on its shelf. Always left to right, always measured, always purposeful. I became addicted to the practice sessions. 20 minutes of left-handed writing each night, enough to keep the apartment calm. My coordination improved rapidly. Too rapidly. It felt less like learning a new skill and more like remembering an old one. The motions became fluid, natural, as if my left hand was waking up from a long sleep. The handwriting that emerged wasn't my own. At first, I attributed the differences to inexperience. Left-handed writing naturally looked different. More vertical, different letter formations, unique flourishes. But as my skill improved, as the movements became automatic, I realized I was writing in someone else's style. The letters leaned differently than my natural penmanship. The spacing was tighter. The pressure patterns were all wrong. I was channeling someone else's motor memory. The revelation came when I found old letters in my grandmother's effects, stored in a box I'd never bothered to open. Her handwriting, left-handed, forced into right-handed submission by teachers who'd tied her natural hand behind her back, matched perfectly with what was flowing from my fingers. But my grandmother had been dead for 15 years. I stopped the evening practice sessions, determined to break whatever psychological pattern I'd created. The apartment immediately became active again, but with increased intensity. Objects moved farther, faster. The candle holder began sliding the entire length of the drawer, metal scraping against wood with an urgency that made my teeth ache. The ruler didn't just shift, it rotated, pointing in different directions like a compass needle searching for magnetic north. After 3 sleepless nights, I gave in and resumed the left-handed writing. The activity stopped instantly, as if someone had exhaled in relief. I researched everything I could find about inherited memory, genetic motor patterns, psychological imprinting. Scientific journals spoke of muscle memory passing through generations, of traumatic experiences leaving epigenetic markers. But nothing explained why my apartment had become a stage for someone else's frustrated left-handedness, or why my practice sessions satisfied whatever presence had taken residence in my space. The writing sessions became conversations. I would start with simple exercises, my name, the date, basic words, and then let my left hand move freely across the page. What emerged was a flowing script that told stories I'd never heard, described memories I'd never lived, stories about being forced to write with the wrong hand, about the frustration of moving through a world designed for someone else's natural movements. The handwriting spoke of feeling backwards, displaced, constantly fighting against the grain of ordinary existence. It described the exhaustion of performing simple tasks in unnatural ways, of never quite fitting into spaces designed for different bodies, different brains, different ways of being. I began to understand that I wasn't being haunted by my grandmother. I was being haunted by myself, by the left-handed child I'd been trained to suppress, by the natural movements that had been corrected out of existence. The objects in my apartment were moving the way I would have moved them if I'd been allowed to develop naturally. Left to right, backwards from my forced patterns, following the spatial logic of a suppressed identity. The practice sessions weren't calming a ghost. They were feeding a starved part of my own nervous system, giving expression to motor patterns that had been dormant for decades. My left hand was remembering how to be dominant, and the rest of my body, my unconscious mind, my spatial awareness, my relationship with physical objects, was responding to that awakening. But knowing the mechanism didn't make it less unsettling. If anything, the psychological explanation was more disturbing than supernatural possession. It meant I'd been living as a stranger to myself, that fundamental aspects of my personality and perception had been altered so early and so completely that I'd forgotten they existed. It meant I didn't know who I really was. The writing sessions continued, but now they felt like negotiations with an internal presence that had equal claim to my body. My left hand moved with increasing confidence, developing its own relationship with space and objects. Sometimes I would find myself reaching for things left-handed without thinking, or automatically stepping to the left instead of right. I was becoming ambidextrous, but it felt more like I was becoming multiple people sharing the same nervous system. The right-handed version of myself who'd lived for 34 years, and the left-handed version who'd been waiting underground, practicing in secret, moving objects when no one was watching. The apartment became a laboratory for exploring these dual selves. I started leaving objects in specific positions and documenting how they moved during the night. The patterns were consistent, always corrections, always adjustments toward left-handed logic. A coffee mug moved to the left side of the sink. Books rearranged themselves so their spines could be read more easily by someone approaching from the right. Even the position of my laptop shifted subtly, angled for left-handed typing. My space was being remodeled by my own unconscious mind, optimized for a handedness I'd been taught to suppress. The most disturbing discovery came when I reviewed the security footage more carefully. The movements weren't random or mysterious. They were purposeful corrections, made by my own hands during periods I couldn't remember. The camera captured me moving through the apartment in what appeared to be a dissociated state, rearranging objects with my left hand while my conscious mind was elsewhere. I was sleepwalking, but only with half my body. My left hand was taking independent action while the rest of me remained unconscious. Now, months later, I've established a routine that keeps both versions of myself satisfied. Evening writing sessions with my left hand, documenting memories and movements that feel inherited from someone else. Careful attention to how I arrange objects, allowing both hands to participate in organizing my space. The apartment has reached an equilibrium, but it's an uneasy peace. I know now that I'm not alone here, not because of a supernatural presence, but because I'm sharing this body with an identity I've spent decades forgetting. The left-handed version of myself who moves through space differently, who sees the world from a different angle, who has spent 34 years making subtle corrections to a life arranged for someone else. Sometimes I wonder which one of us is the real me. The careful right-handed software developer who follows conventional patterns, or the intuitive left-handed presence who rearranges reality when no one is watching. Both feel equally authentic, equally foreign. What I know for certain is that I can't ignore either one anymore. The objects in my apartment will continue to migrate, following the spatial logic of a suppressed identity. My left hand will continue to write stories I don't remember living, describing a world I've never consciously inhabited, and I will continue to practice each night, feeding the starved neural pathways of a handedness that refuses to stay buried, giving voice to the parts of myself that were corrected into silence, but never truly erased. The question isn't whether I'm losing my mind. The question is whether I ever really had just one mind to lose. Story 7. The first time I heard a train whistle, I was 32 years old and standing in my kitchen, slicing onions for dinner. The sound drifted through my window from somewhere distant, a lonesome metallic cry that seemed to pierce through the suburban evening like a needle through fabric. What happened next defied every rational explanation I'd spent 3 decades building. My left forearm began to burn. Not the gradual heat of inflammation or the sharp bite of a cut, but something else entirely. When I rolled up my sleeve, 3 parallel red lines had appeared on my skin, each perfectly straight and evenly spaced, as if someone had pressed railroad tracks into my flesh. They faded within minutes, leaving only a faint tingling and the absolute certainty that something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of the world. That was 6 months ago. Since then, I've made the 4-hour drive to the crossing in Millfield, Pennsylvania, 17 times. The crossing sits at the edge of a town that time seems to have forgotten, where Main Street ends in a cluster of weathered buildings, and the railroad cuts through like a scar across the landscape. It's not marked on most maps, just a simple intersection, where County Road 47 meets the tracks, protected by nothing more than faded warning signs and a pair of rusted crossing lights that blink amber in an irregular rhythm. I always park in the same spot, a gravel pull-off about 50 yards from the tracks, and walk to the wooden post that supports the crossing sign. The post leans slightly to the left, worn smooth by decades of weather, and the occasional hand that needs something solid to grip. When I reach it, I check my watch out of habit, though I already know what I'll find. 2 minutes slow. Always exactly 2 minutes slow. My therapist suggested hypnosis during our 3rd session, her voice gentle but probing as she tried to understand why I kept returning to a place that clearly caused me distress. I declined, unable to articulate that whatever was happening at the crossing felt too important to simply erase or overcome. Instead, I found myself making excuses to drive back. A weekend trip to visit colleges I'd never attended, business meetings in towns I had no business visiting, detours that grew increasingly elaborate as I struggled to justify the compulsion that pulled me east like a magnetic force. Each visit reveals subtle changes that shouldn't matter, but somehow do. The stop sign that was leaning 15 degrees to the right now tilts 10 degrees to the left. Fresh asphalt patches appear overnight in different configurations, creating a random pattern of dark spots against the faded road surface. A mailbox that stood at the corner house disappears between visits, only to reappear painted a different color and facing the opposite direction. The changes feel deliberate, like someone is adjusting the scenery between acts of a play I'm unwittingly performing in. On my 7th visit, I encountered the guard. He emerged from a small utility shed I'd never noticed before, positioned just inside the tree line that bordered the eastern side of the tracks. The shed was weathered gray, its door hanging slightly askew on hinges that squealed in protest as he pushed it open. He wore the kind of clothes that suggested practical work: canvas pants, a flannel shirt, heavy boots caked with mud, and rust-colored stains that might have been dirt. The guard was perhaps 60, with silver hair cut short and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. When he spotted me standing by the post, his face shifted into an expression of weary recognition, as if I were a regular customer arriving for an appointment he'd rather not keep. He approached with the measured pace of someone who'd walked these tracks for years, his boots crunching on the gravel ballast. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat consonants of rural Pennsylvania, words shaped by years of calling out warnings over the rumble of approaching trains. He said he recognized me, claimed I'd been coming to the crossing for months. When I protested that this was only my first or second visit, he shook his head with the patience of someone correcting a child's obvious mistake. He insisted he knew me by the way I leaned against the post, the way I checked my watch, the way I tilted my head to listen for approaching trains. The conversation lasted perhaps 5 minutes, but felt both eternal and impossibly brief. When I tried to explain that I lived 4 hours away and had only recently discovered the crossing, he gave me a look that mixed pity with something approaching fear. Before walking away, he mentioned that the evening train was running late again, and that I should probably head back to my car soon. I hadn't mentioned anything about expecting a train. That night, I sat in my motel room and tried to map the timeline of my visits, using receipts and credit card statements to establish concrete dates. The evidence painted a clear picture. I'd first driven to Millfield on a Tuesday in September, returning roughly every 2 weeks since then. Yet the guard's certainty, his familiarity with my habits, suggested a pattern spanning months or even years. I checked my phone's photo gallery, scrolling through images I'd taken at the crossing to document the changes I'd observed. The metadata showed creation dates that didn't match my carefully constructed timeline, photos supposedly taken weeks before my first documented visit, images of the crossing in different seasons, under different weather conditions, from angles I couldn't remember shooting. In one photo, taken according to the timestamp in early July, I could see a figure in the background standing beside the utility shed. The image was too distant and blurry to make out features, but the posture was unmistakably mine. The same casual lean against a fence post, the same way of checking my watch, the same angle of my head as I looked down the tracks. The discovery sent me back to Millfield the following weekend, determined to find some rational explanation for what was clearly becoming an unhealthy obsession. I brought a digital camera this time, along with a small notebook to document my observations methodically. If I was losing time somehow, creating false memories or suffering from some form of dissociative disorder, careful record-keeping might reveal the pattern. The crossing looked exactly as I remembered, except for a new addition: a small white sign mounted on the utility shed that read, "Authorized personnel only," in block letters. The sign was clean and bright, clearly installed recently, though I could have sworn the shed had been unmarked during previous visits. I spent 3 hours that day, walking the perimeter of the crossing and photographing everything from multiple angles. The digital camera's display showed normal images, the tracks stretching into the distance, the warning signs, the gravel road surface, the surrounding trees beginning to show their autumn colors. But when I reviewed the photos later that evening, nearly half showed distortions I hadn't noticed while shooting. Shadows that fell at impossible angles, reflections in windows of buildings that weren't visible in the frame, and in several images, the faint outline of a train that definitely hadn't been there. The guard appeared again during my 12th visit, emerging from the shed as if he'd been waiting for me to arrive. This time he seemed less surprised by my presence and more concerned. the way a doctor might look at a patient whose condition was steadily worsening. He asked how long I'd been experiencing the episodes, using a term I'd never applied to my visits, but that somehow felt accurate. When I asked what he meant, he gestured toward my left arm and suggested I might want to roll up my sleeve. 3 red lines had appeared, perfectly parallel and evenly spaced, though I hadn't heard any train whistle. The marks were darker than usual, more pronounced, and they pulsed with a rhythm that seemed to match my heartbeat. The guard explained that the crossing had always been problematic, that certain people seemed to get pulled in by something he couldn't quite name. He'd worked the railroad for 38 years before retiring, and in that time, he'd seen dozens of folks who kept coming back to this particular spot. Most eventually moved away or learned to avoid the area, but a few became what he called regulars, people who got caught in some kind of loop they couldn't break free from. He mentioned that the evening train hadn't run this route in over 6 years, that the tracks were officially abandoned and scheduled for removal by the county. Yet every few weeks he still heard the whistle echoing across the valley, still saw the crossing lights activate for trains that weren't there. Railroad property was railroad property until it was officially decommissioned, and someone needed to keep an eye on things until the paperwork was finalized. As he spoke, I realized I could hear it too, a distant rumbling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails that grew steadily louder. The crossing lights began their familiar amber blinking, though faster now, more urgent. The guard glanced toward the tracks with an expression that mixed resignation with genuine worry. He suggested I might want to get back to my car. I drove home that night with the radio turned up loud, trying to drown out the phantom sound of train wheels that seemed to follow me down the highway. When I checked my arm the next morning, the red lines were still there, fainter but persistent, like scars that refused to heal properly. The 17th visit happened this past weekend, though I have no clear memory of deciding to make the drive. I remember being in my apartment on Friday evening, and then suddenly standing beside the crossing on Sunday afternoon, with no recollection of the intervening time. My car was parked in the usual spot, the odometer showing an additional 300 miles, my wallet containing receipts from gas stations and restaurants along the route to Millfield. This time, the crossing looked different in ways I couldn't immediately identify. The warning signs were the same, the tracks ran in the same direction, the utility shed stood in its familiar position among the trees. But something about the proportions felt wrong, as if everything had been scaled slightly larger or smaller, creating a space that was almost but not quite the place I'd been visiting for months. The guard was waiting for me, but he looked older than I remembered, his hair completely white now, his face marked by lines that seemed to have deepened since our last encounter. When he saw me approaching the post, he shook his head with something approaching sorrow. He said I was getting worse, that whatever had taken hold of me was stronger than most cases he'd seen. He asked if I'd considered that maybe I wasn't coming to the crossing, but rather that the crossing was coming to me. The distinction seemed important to him, though I couldn't understand why. He explained that some places exist in more than one version of reality, that the crossing I'd been visiting might not be the same crossing that appeared on county maps or railroad surveys. He'd seen it happen before. People who got pulled into one of the other versions, places that looked identical but operated according to different rules. The evening train was coming soon, he said, and this time I should probably stay to see it. After 17 visits, I'd earned the right to understand what was happening to me. He warned that seeing the train would change things, that I might not be able to leave the crossing afterward, but that continuing to fight the pull was causing more damage than simply accepting whatever was going to happen. As he spoke, I became aware that the red lines on my arm were burning again, more intensely than ever before. When I looked down, I could see them clearly through my shirt sleeve, glowing with a dim red light that pulsed in rhythm with the approaching rumble of the train. The crossing lights had stopped their irregular blinking and now shone steady amber, casting everything in a warm, honeyed glow that made the familiar landscape look simultaneously inviting and ominous. The rumbling grew louder, accompanied by the rhythmic clacking of wheels that seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat. I checked my watch out of habit and found that it had stopped completely, its hands frozen at 6:47. When I looked up, the guard was gone, though I hadn't seen him leave. The utility shed stood empty, its door swinging open in a breeze I couldn't feel. The train whistle sounded then, long and mournful, echoing across the valley with a resonance that seemed to vibrate through my bones. I rolled up my sleeve and watched the red lines darken and spread, branching like tributaries from a river, creating an intricate network of tracks across my skin. In the distance, a headlight appeared around the bend, growing brighter as it approached the crossing. The light was wrong somehow. Too white, too intense, casting shadows that fell upward instead of down. As the train drew closer, I realized I could see through it, that the locomotive and cars were translucent, like images projected onto the air. The ghost train passed through the crossing without slowing, its whistle dopplering away into the distance until silence returned to the valley. When it was gone, I found myself alone beside the tracks, standing in a place that looked exactly like the crossing I'd been visiting for months, but felt completely different. My watch had started again, but it now ran 2 minutes fast instead of slow. I don't know how long I stood there before walking back to my car. The drive home passed in a blur of highway lights and radio static, and I arrived at my apartment with no clear memory of the journey. When I tried to sleep that night, I could hear the distant sound of train wheels, steady and rhythmic, like a lullaby that never quite ends. This morning, I woke to find that the red lines on my arm had become permanent, etched into my skin like tattoos I never chose to get. They don't hurt anymore, but they pulse gently with their own internal rhythm, as if something is moving through them just beneath the surface. I haven't decided whether I'll return to the crossing again. Part of me knows I will, that whatever happened there isn't finished yet. But another part suspects that the crossing will come to me instead, that the distance between Millfield and my apartment is shrinking with each passing day. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the train whistle echoing through my neighborhood streets, and I know that soon I'll need to decide whether to answer its call or spend the rest of my life running from a sound that follows me wherever I go. The choice I'm beginning to understand might not be mine to make. Story 8. The constant hum of the 405 freeway had become my white noise machine. 2 blocks away, engines roared and sirens wailed through the Los Angeles night, a mechanical lullaby that had helped me sleep for the past 8 months. I'd grown accustomed to the rhythm, the ebb and flow of traffic that never truly stopped, only thinned during the dead hours between 2 and 4 in the morning. That's when I first heard it. The sharp, deliberate clip-clop of hooves on asphalt cut through the urban symphony like a blade. I lay frozen in bed, my eyes snapping open to the darkness of my studio apartment. The sound was unmistakable, the measured gait of a large animal, each step echoing off the narrow walls of the alley below. But what made my skin crawl was the accompanying sound, the harsh scrape and rattle of metal chains dragging across pavement. I held my breath, waiting for the logical explanation. Perhaps a movie crew filming some period piece, though it seemed unlikely at 3 in the morning. The hoofbeats continued their steady rhythm, growing closer to my building. Through the thin slats of my blinds, a shadow passed across my wall. Tall, impossibly tall, with the unmistakable silhouette of a rider and the angular outline of hooves beneath. The entire building seemed to hold its breath. The omnipresent traffic noise faded to nothing, as if someone had thrown a switch and muted the city itself. In that supernatural quiet, I could hear every detail, the creak of leather, the jingle of metal fittings, and underneath it all, that relentless dragging of chains. I crept to the window, my bare feet silent on the cold hardwood floor. Peering through the gap in the blinds, I looked down at the narrow alley that ran behind our building. Empty. Nothing but shadows, and the weak orange glow of a single streetlight at the far end. But on my window, on the outside of the glass, was something that made my throat tighten. A patch of condensation in the shape of a large muzzle, as if something had pressed its nose against the pane and breathed. The next morning brought the familiar chaos of traffic and city life. I convinced myself it had been a dream, or perhaps some late-night filming I hadn't noticed. But when I mentioned it to my neighbor across the hall, she gave me a look that made me wish I'd kept quiet. "You heard it too," she said. Not a question, but a statement delivered with the weight of shared experience. She was an older woman, had lived in the building longer than anyone else, and her eyes held secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I waited for her to elaborate, but she simply retreated into her apartment, leaving me standing in the hallway with more questions than answers. The second night, the sounds returned. This time, I was ready. I'd positioned myself by the window before midnight, determined to catch whatever was creating this disturbance. But when the hoofbeats came, they weren't in the alley below. They were in the hallway outside my door. The impossibility of it hit me like a physical blow. We lived on the fourth floor of a building with narrow corridors carpeted in industrial gray fabric. No animal could navigate the stairwell, much less create the sharp, echoing reports I was hearing through the thin walls. Yet there it was, the unmistakable sound of iron shoes on a hard surface, as if the carpeting had vanished and the concrete beneath was bare. I pressed my ear to the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. The hoofbeats passed my apartment slowly, accompanied by that terrible dragging sound. But now I could hear something else, breathing, deep, labored breaths that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. When I finally worked up the courage to look through the peephole, the hallway was empty, but my keys, hanging on their hook by the door, were trembling against each other, creating a soft metallic whisper that raised goosebumps along my arms. Sleep became elusive. I found myself lying awake each night, waiting. Sometimes nothing happened. Other nights, the sounds would drift through the building like a ghost ship sailing through solid walls. I began to notice patterns. The hoofbeats always moved from east to west, following what seemed to be a specific route through the building and the neighborhood beyond. My productivity at work suffered. Dark circles appeared under my eyes, and my colleagues began asking if I was feeling all right. I started avoiding my apartment during the hours when I knew the sounds might come, spending evenings at coffee shops and bars, anywhere but home. It was during one of these self-imposed exiles that I met her, the building manager, a pragmatic woman in her 50s who had access to the property records. Over coffee, I carefully broached the subject of our building's history. "This whole block used to be different," she told me, stirring sugar into her cup with mechanical precision. "Before the freeway went in, before all this development, there was a route that ran right through here, from the old pueblo to the port. Ox carts mostly, bringing goods back and forth." My coffee had gone cold in my hands. "Ox carts?" She nodded. "Heavy loads. They'd chain the cargo down, drag it through the mud when the wagons got stuck. The route went right through where our building sits now, that little alley behind us. It follows the old path exactly." I wanted to ask more, but something in her expression warned me off. She seemed to realize she'd said too much, her eyes growing distant and guarded. "Just history," she added quickly, as if trying to convince herself as much as me. "Nothing threatening about old stories." But her words had the opposite effect. That night, I lay in bed with my eyes fixed on the ceiling, waiting for sounds that came with the regularity of a heartbeat. When they arrived, I didn't go to the window. I didn't press my ear to the door. I simply listened as something that shouldn't exist made its nightly journey through the bones of my building. The hoofbeats had developed variations, sometimes urgent, sometimes leisurely, as if whatever created them was responding to some unseen circumstance. The chains had grown heavier too, their dragging more pronounced, scraping along surfaces that couldn't possibly support their weight. I began to research the area's history obsessively, spending hours in the library downtown, poring over old maps and records. The route the building manager had mentioned was real. I found references to it in shipping ledgers from the 1800s. But what disturbed me were the incident reports. Carts overturning, oxen dying from exhaustion, men vanishing on the dark stretch between the pueblo and the coast. The records spoke of accidents, but reading between the lines, I sensed something more deliberate. Animals driven beyond endurance. Loads that should have been manageable becoming impossible burdens. The route seemed to demand sacrifice, as if the very earth beneath those wheels was hungry. My apartment began to feel like a prison. The walls seemed closer together each day, the shadows deeper. I found myself checking the locks obsessively, though I couldn't say what I was trying to keep out or in. The trembling of my keys had become constant whenever the sounds began. as if they were responding to some magnetic pull I couldn't perceive. Sleep, when it came, brought dreams of dust and leather, of massive wheels cutting deep grooves in soft earth. I would wake with the taste of iron in my mouth and the phantom sensation of weight pressing down on my chest, as if invisible chains had been laid across my body during the night. The breaking point came on a Thursday night when the sounds didn't follow their usual pattern. Instead of passing through the hallway and moving on, they stopped directly outside my door. The hoofbeats ceased, but the breathing continued, deep, patient exhalations that seemed to fog the very air in my apartment. I sat paralyzed on my bed, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. Through the gap under my door, I could see the shadow of something massive blocking the hallway light. The shadow had the wrong proportions, too tall, too angular, as if legs and rider had been stretched beyond natural limits. Minutes passed. Hours, perhaps. Time became elastic in that darkness, warping around the weight of whatever waited outside. My keys had stopped trembling and now hung perfectly still, as if even they were holding their breath. When morning came, I found myself slumped against my bedroom wall, fully dressed, with no memory of moving from the bed. The hallway outside was empty, but in the carpet near my door, I found them. Deep impressions in the fabric, circular marks too large to be from any normal shoe, pressed into the fibers as if something impossibly heavy had stood there for hours. I spoke to the building manager again, but she avoided eye contact and claimed she knew nothing about any historical incidents. My neighbor across the hall had moved out suddenly, leaving no forwarding address. Other residents seemed to drift past me like sleepwalkers, their eyes sliding away whenever I tried to engage them in conversation about what they might have heard. The research had become my obsession. I discovered that our building sat at the exact center of what had once been called the deadweight route, a name that appeared in only the oldest records, usually crossed out or written in margins, as if someone had tried to erase it from official history. The ox carts that used this path carried more than goods. They transported the bodies of those who had died building the pueblo, taking them to burial grounds that were later paved over when the city expanded. Each cart had been weighted down with chains to prevent the dead from shifting during transport. Each ox team had been worked until they dropped, then replaced with fresh animals who would inherit the same cursed burden. The route had operated for decades, leaving a groove in the earth so deep that rain would pool there for days after storms. Now I understood why my building felt different during the night hours. We weren't just living above old ground. We were living above a scar in the earth itself, a wound that had never properly healed. The hoofbeats and chains weren't echoes of the past. They were the past, bleeding through into the present like an infection that had never been cleaned. The sounds have become my calendar now. They mark time more reliably than any clock, dividing my nights into before and after. I've stopped trying to see what creates them, stopped pressing my face to windows and doors. Instead, I listen. I've learned to distinguish between the different loads, some heavy with sorrow, others weighted with rage. My keys still tremble when the sounds begin, but I've come to understand what they're telling me. They're not warning me to stay inside. They're asking permission to join the procession. Each key wants to add its small weight to the eternal cargo, to become part of the chain that binds this place to its history. I've been measuring the impressions in the carpet outside my door. They're getting deeper each night, as if whatever stands there is growing heavier, accumulating mass from somewhere beyond the visible world. Soon, I think, they'll break through the floor entirely, creating a hole that leads not to the apartment below, but to the root itself, that dark channel carved into the earth by decades of desperate hauling. When that happens, I'll have a choice to make. I can continue living above the scar, pretending that the sounds are just traffic noise and the shadows are just tricks of light. Or I can step through that hole and join the procession that never truly ended, adding my weight to a burden that grows heavier with each soul it claims. My keys are trembling again. Outside, the hoofbeats approach with their familiar rhythm, but tonight they sound different, expectant, almost eager. The chains drag with a new melody, one that seems to whisper my name with each scrape against the pavement. I think I finally understand what they've been waiting for. Story 9. The first time I saw him, I thought it was just another vivid nightmare, the kind that leaves you sitting up in bed at 3 a.m., heart hammering against your ribs, sheets damp with cold sweat. But this dream felt different, too precise, too consistent. And when I woke up, my carpet was soaked. I was 23 then, fresh out of college, renting a studio on the third floor of a converted brownstone on Charles Street in Baltimore. The building had that old money charm that comes with creaky hardwood floors and radiators that clanged like prisoners rattling chains. My apartment faced east, catching the morning light through two tall windows that made the space feel larger than its 400 square feet. I'd chosen it for the light, not knowing I'd spend most nights afraid to sleep. The dream always started the same way. I'd be lying in bed, somewhere between sleep and waking, when I'd become aware of a presence. Not a sound or movement, just the sudden weight of being watched. Then I'd see him, a man in his 30s or 40s, sitting on the edge of my bed with his back to me. His shoulders would shake with silent sobs, hands pressed against his face as if trying to hold something in. His shirt, always a blue button-down, would be darkening with moisture, the fabric clinging to his chest and back. But it was his shoes that haunted me most. White canvas sneakers, the kind that cost $20 at any department store. Water would drip steadily from them, hitting my carpet with tiny splashes that seemed impossibly loud in the dream's silence. The drops would form a specific pattern, 3 larger puddles near the bed's foot, connected by smaller spots that curved like a question mark. Always the same configuration, always the exact same rhythm of drops. Night after night, I'd watch this scene unfold, paralyzed not by fear but by a strange sense of inevitability. The man never acknowledged my presence, never turned around. He just sat there, crying his soundless tears, letting his shoes bleed water onto my floor until I'd finally wake up, always at 3:17 a.m., always with the taste of salt in my mouth. The wet spots on my carpet were real. I told myself it was condensation. The building was old, pipes ran through the walls, and my apartment was on the 3rd floor. Maybe something was leaking. I bought a dehumidifier from a secondhand store, a bulky white machine that hummed like a giant insect. For a few weeks, the dream stopped, and I convinced myself I'd solved a perfectly mundane problem. But the relief was temporary. The man returned, and with him came a new detail that made my skin crawl. The dehumidifier would click on by itself whenever he appeared, its motor whirring to life just as his form materialized at the foot of my bed. The machine's LED display would flicker from green to red, indicating humidity levels that shouldn't have been possible in a room I kept deliberately dry. I moved out after 8 months, telling my landlord I'd found a better place. The truth was, I couldn't stand another night in that room, couldn't bear to see those same puddles forming on my carpet, while the dehumidifier struggled against an impossible saturation in the air. My second apartment was 2 blocks north, a 1-bedroom on the 2nd floor of another converted row house. Different building, different block, same neighborhood. I thought distance would break whatever psychological pattern had developed. I threw away the old dehumidifier and bought everything new, furniture, bedding, even the carpet. For 3 months I slept peacefully. Then he came back. The dream was identical down to the smallest detail. Same blue shirt, same white sneakers, same pattern of water spots on my new carpet, same silent sobbing, same time of night. But now there was an added layer of wrongness. How could he find me here? How could a figment of my imagination carry over to a completely different space? I started researching the neighborhood's history, spending hours at the local library poring over old newspapers and city records. Charles Street had seen its share of tragedy over the decades. House fires, car accidents, the usual urban sorrows, but nothing that connected to a man in canvas sneakers crying beside strangers' beds. I found no reports of flooding, no water-related incidents that might explain the persistent dampness that followed his visits. The dreams came more frequently in the second apartment, sometimes twice a week, sometimes 3 nights in a row. Each time, I'd wake to find my carpet marked with those same impossible puddles, and each time I'd mop them up with towels that became inexplicably heavy with absorbed moisture. The weight of the water felt wrong, too dense, too persistent. It took hours to dry, and even then, the spots would remain visible as faint shadows in the carpet fibers. I bought another dehumidifier, a more expensive model with digital controls and a larger tank. Like its predecessor, it would activate itself whenever my visitor appeared, struggling against humidity levels that defied the room's actual conditions. I'd wake to find its collection tank full of water that looked perfectly clear but felt somehow thick between my fingers. The second move came after 18 months, prompted not by the dreams themselves, but by what happened one October morning. I was taking out trash when I ran into Mrs. Chen from the apartment below mine. She was a quiet woman in her 70s, who always nodded politely when we passed in the hallway. That morning, she stopped me near the building's entrance. "Your plumbing fixed?" she asked, her English careful and precise. I told her I wasn't aware of any plumbing problems. "Water spots," she explained, gesturing toward the ceiling of her apartment. "Same pattern every few nights. Building manager says no leaks in walls." My stomach dropped. I mumbled something about checking with the landlord and hurried away, but I couldn't shake the image of those familiar puddles appearing on someone else's ceiling. If Mrs. Chen was seeing water damage in the exact pattern of my dream's aftermath, what did that mean? Was I somehow causing real water to manifest? Was the building actually haunted? Or was I losing my grip on reality in ways I hadn't yet recognized? The third apartment was my attempt at a fresh start, a garden-level unit on the same block, but in a newer building, 1970s construction with better insulation and modern plumbing. No historical baggage, no mysterious moisture issues. I'd lived there for 6 weeks without incident when I met him at the coffee shop on the corner. He was maybe 45, with the kind of prematurely gray hair that comes from stress rather than age. We'd been neighbors for years, he said, though I didn't recognize him from my previous addresses. He lived in the building next to my current one, had been there for almost a decade. We talked about the neighborhood, the weather, the way gentrification was changing the character of the blocks we both called home. Then he mentioned his carpet. "Strangest thing," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "Got these water stains that keep reappearing. Same spots, same pattern. Building management thinks I'm crazy. No leaks anywhere, but twice a week I wake up to puddles on my floor." The pattern he described made my hands tremble around my mug. 3 larger spots connected by smaller ones in a curve. He'd even taken photos to show the management company, pulling out his phone to display images that matched my dreams with terrifying precision. I told him about my experiences, leaving out the part about the crying man. Just the water damage, the consistent pattern, the mysterious humidity. His face went pale as I spoke. "Mine doesn't sit on the bed," he said quietly. "He sits in the chair by my window. Never makes a sound, just cries into his hands. Always wearing those white sneakers." We stared at each other across the small table, 2 grown men suddenly confronted with the impossibility of our shared experience. Neither of us suggested it might be coincidence. Neither of us laughed or tried to rationalize what we'd just learned. The weight of recognition was too heavy for denial. He asked if I'd tried a dehumidifier. I nodded and told him about the machines turning themselves on, the tanks filling with impossible water. "Mine too," he whispered, "always at 3:17. That night, I lay in bed with every light in my apartment burning, watching the digital clock on my nightstand approach the cursed time. At 3:15, my new dehumidifier clicked to life, its motor humming with mechanical certainty. At 3:16, the humidity reading on its display began climbing from 30% to 60, then 70, then numbers that shouldn't have been possible. At 3:17 he appeared. This time I forced myself to really look at him, to study the details I'd been too frightened to examine before. His hair was dark, but thinning at the crown. His shirt was a specific shade of blue, not navy, not royal, but something in between, with thin vertical stripes barely visible in the dim light. His pants were dark jeans, and those white sneakers were scuffed along the sides as if he'd been walking on rough concrete. But it was his hands that held my attention now. They were pressed against his face, but I could see they were marked with small cuts and scrapes. Working hands. And between his fingers, tears leaked steadily, falling to his shirt. soaking through the fabric with a persistence that defied physics. Water dripped from his shoes onto my carpet with the rhythm of a broken faucet. Drip, drip, drip. Each drop hitting my floor with a soft splash that seemed to echo in the room's strange silence. The puddles formed in their predetermined pattern, 3 larger pools connected by smaller spots that curved like a question mark, or maybe a fishhook. I wanted to speak, to ask who he was or what he needed, but my voice felt trapped behind my teeth, as if the air in the room had become too thick to carry sound. All I could do was watch as this impossible figure continued his vigil at the foot of my bed, crying tears that became water that became puddles that would be real when I woke up. The dehumidifier's motor strained against the rising humidity, its collection tank filling with clear water that reflected my bedroom lights like captured starlight. The machine's display flickered between readings, climbing past 80%, past 90%, into territory that should have made breathing difficult. But the air felt normal, dry even, except for the steady presence of moisture flowing from my visitor's endless grief. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because I woke at 3:17 a.m. to silence and the familiar weight of damp carpet beneath my feet when I climbed out of bed. The puddles were there, perfectly formed, exactly as they always were. The dehumidifier had shut itself off, its tank full of water that looked ordinary but felt somehow charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. But something was different this time. Near the largest puddle, pressed into the wet carpet fibers, was a single footprint, not a complete impression, just the outline of a toe and part of a sole, the kind of mark a canvas sneaker might leave when pressed into damp fabric. I knelt beside it, studying the details. The tread pattern was visible, worn smooth in places that suggested long walks on city sidewalks. The size looked like a 10 or 11, with a narrow heel that spoke of someone who walked lightly despite their apparent sorrow. The footprint was real, undeniably, physically real. That morning, I called my neighbor from the coffee shop. We met again, this time at his apartment. His carpet bore the same marks, not just the familiar water pattern, but footprints pressed into the damp fibers. His were different, though, the outline of a heel and instep where someone had shifted their weight while sitting in a chair. "How long has this been happening to you?" I asked. 8 years, he said. "Started right after I moved in. First few times, I thought someone was breaking in somehow. I changed the locks, installed a security system. Nothing helped." "Why haven't you moved?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Where would I go? This thing, whatever it is, it's not connected to the building. It's connected to the block. Maybe to the whole neighborhood. I've talked to other people. Quietly, carefully. There are more of us." The revelation shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. The idea that this experience extended beyond just the two of us made it somehow worse. A single haunting could be explained away, rationalized as stress or sleep deprivation or atmospheric pressure. But multiple witnesses across multiple buildings suggested something larger, something that defied explanation. "What do you think he wants?" I asked. My neighbor shrugged, but his eyes held the weight of years spent wondering the same thing. "I don't think he wants anything. I think he's just stuck, caught in some kind of loop, playing out the same moment over and over, and for some reason, we're the ones who get to watch." That night I decided to stay awake, to confront whatever was happening, to force some kind of resolution. I positioned myself in a chair across from my bed, armed with a flashlight and a notebook, determined to document every detail of my visitor's appearance. If this was a breakdown, at least I'd have a record. If it was something else, well, maybe observation would provide answers. At 3:15, the dehumidifier clicked on. At 3:16, the humidity readings began their impossible climb. At 3:17, the space at the foot of my bed began to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. But this time, he didn't appear immediately. Instead, the shimmer held for several seconds, wavering between visible and not, as if my attention was somehow interfering with the manifestation. I could feel pressure building in the room, the way air feels heavy before a storm breaks. My ears popped and the taste of salt flooded my mouth. Then he solidified, sitting on the edge of my bed exactly as he always had. But now, watching from a different angle, I could see his profile. His face was partially hidden by his hands, but I caught glimpses of features that seemed familiar in a way I couldn't place. The slope of his nose, the curve of his jawline, details that triggered a sense of recognition I couldn't quite access. Water continued to drip from his sneakers, each drop hitting my carpet with crystalline clarity. The sound was different when heard from across the room. Not just dripping, but almost musical, like rain on a tin roof. The puddles formed with their usual precision, but watching the process unfold, I realized the pattern wasn't random. It was deliberate, purposeful, as if the water was following channels carved into the carpet by years of repetition. The man's sobbing was silent, but his shoulders shook with genuine grief. Whatever sorrow he carried wasn't performed or dramatic. It was the kind of deep, bone-deep pain that comes from loss so profound it changes your molecular structure. I found myself leaning forward, wanting to offer comfort to this impossible figure who seemed trapped in eternal mourning. That's when he looked up. Our eyes met across the dark room, and the air between us seemed to solidify. His face was exactly what I'd expected. Middle-aged, worn by worry, marked with the kind of lines that come from carrying burdens too heavy for one person. But it was also a face I recognized, though I couldn't place from where. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but instead of words, water poured out. Not a trickle or a stream, but a steady flow that splashed onto his shirt and ran down his chest like a broken faucet. His eyes widened with what looked like surprise, as if this was a new development in his nightly routine. The water kept coming, more than any human mouth could hold, more than seemed physically possible. It soaked his shirt completely, pooled in his lap, cascaded onto my carpet in volumes that should have flooded the room. But somehow, the water stayed contained within the familiar pattern, as if invisible barriers kept it from spreading beyond predetermined boundaries. My dehumidifier's motor screamed with effort, its display flickering through humidity readings that climbed past 100% into territory that should have been impossible in any earthly atmosphere. The collection tank overflowed, adding to the spreading puddle around the machine, but still the readings climbed. The man on my bed continued to pour water from his mouth, his eyes locked on mine with an expression of desperate communication. He was trying to tell me something, but the only language he had was this endless flow of clear, impossible water. His hands moved to his throat as if to stop the torrent, but it continued unabated, turning my bedroom into something between a crime scene and a baptism. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor, and took a step toward him. As soon as I moved, he began to fade, the shimmer returning as his form lost solidity. The water flow slowed, then stopped, and within seconds he was gone, leaving only the familiar puddles and the mechanical whine of my struggling dehumidifier. But this time, something was different. Mixed in with the usual clear water were darker spots, not dirt or sediment, but shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. They swirled through the puddles like ink in clear water, forming shapes that looked almost like letters or symbols, before dissolving back into meaningless patterns. I knelt beside the largest puddle and dipped my finger into the water. It felt exactly like regular tap water, cool, thin, unremarkable. But when I brought my wet finger to my mouth, the taste was overwhelming. Salt and sadness, and something else I couldn't identify. Something that tasted like remembering. The next morning, I found my neighbor standing outside his building, staring up at the third-floor windows with an expression of profound confusion. "It changed," he said without preamble when I approached. "Last night, something changed." I told him about the water pouring from the man's mouth, about the eye contact, about the shadows in the puddles. He nodded as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. "Mine spoke," he said quietly. First time in 8 years he actually said something. "What did he say?" My neighbor looked at me with eyes that held years of accumulated exhaustion. "He said my name, my full name, including my middle name, which isn't on any of my mail or lease agreements. He said it like he knew me." We stood in silence for a moment, watching morning traffic navigate the narrow street. Normal people going to normal jobs, dealing with normal problems. I envied them their certainty about what was real and what wasn't. "I think," my neighbor said slowly, "we need to find out who he is. Was. Whatever. Because this isn't just happening to us anymore. It's escalating." That evening, I didn't go home. Instead, I walked the neighborhood, looking at every building, every doorway, every patch of sidewalk with new eyes. If this presence was connected to the area, there had to be some record of what had happened here. Some explanation for why a man in white sneakers was trapped in an endless cycle of grief and impossible water. I found it 3 blocks south, where Charles Street intersected with a small side road that most people never noticed. There was a memorial plaque set into the sidewalk, the kind the city installs to commemorate traffic accidents. The bronze was green with age, the lettering worn almost smooth by years of foot traffic, but I could still make out the essential details. A date from 15 years ago, a man's name, and the words, "Beloved son and father." The name meant nothing to me, but something about the date felt significant. I knelt on the sidewalk, running my fingers over the corroded bronze, trying to extract meaning from metal and time. That's when I noticed the stains. The concrete around the memorial was marked with dark spots that looked like old water damage, the kind of permanent discoloration that comes from repeated exposure to moisture. The pattern was familiar, 3 larger stains connected by smaller ones that curved like a question mark, like a fishhook, like the puddles that appeared in my apartment every night at 3:17 a.m. I sat on the sidewalk next to the memorial as the sun set, watching shadows lengthen across the familiar stains. Cars passed, their headlights sweeping over the bronze plaque and the permanent watermarks that surrounded it. Somewhere in this intersection, 15 years ago, a man had died. And somehow his grief had soaked into the neighborhood's foundation, seeping up through pipes and walls and floors, manifesting in the dreams of strangers who happened to sleep above the water table of his sorrow. But that still didn't explain the impossible physics of his visits, the humidity readings that defied measurement, the tanks full of water that appeared from nowhere. It didn't explain how trauma could become liquid, how memory could drip from shoes and pool on carpets, in apartments that didn't exist when the accident happened. As I walked home, my phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor. "Found 3 more. Same dreams, same time, same man. We're meeting tomorrow." I typed back, "Found where it started." At 3:17 a.m. that night, my visitor appeared for what I somehow knew would be the last time. He sat on the edge of my bed as he always had, but now his face was turned toward me from the beginning. Water still dripped from his sneakers, but slower now, as if the source was finally running dry. He opened his mouth, and instead of the torrent from the night before, a single drop fell from his lips to his shirt. Then another. Then nothing. For the first time since these dreams began, he smiled, a sad, grateful expression that transformed his entire face. He looked younger, relieved, as if a burden he'd carried for 15 years was finally being lifted. He stood up slowly, water no longer dripping from his shoes. The puddles on my carpet began to evaporate, not gradually but all at once, rising as mist that caught the light from my windows and scattered into points of brightness before disappearing entirely. My dehumidifier clicked off by itself, its display reading a normal 35% humidity. The man in the blue shirt and white sneakers looked at me one last time, nodded once, and faded away. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but like mist in morning sunlight, present one moment, gone the next, leaving only the faintest sense that something profound had just ended. I never saw him again. Neither did my neighbor or the others who gathered the next evening to share their stories of water and grief and shoes that dripped impossible tears onto familiar carpets. The dreams stopped as suddenly as they'd begun, leaving us all with empty dehumidifier tanks and dry floors, and the lingering question of what we'd actually experienced. Sometimes I wonder if we'd been chosen as witnesses to something that needed to be seen, or if we'd simply been unlucky enough to live above the geographic epicenter of unresolved sorrow. Sometimes I think about the memorial plaque, still embedded in that sidewalk, still surrounded by stains that never fully fade. But mostly, I try not to think about it at all, because even now, years later, whenever I hear the steady drip of water in an otherwise silent room, I taste salt and sadness, and the metallic flavor of mystery that can't be solved, only endured. The dreams have stopped, but the questions remain, pooling in the corners of my memory like water that refuses to dry. Story 10. The porch boards groan beneath my boots as I settle into the same weathered chair where she used to sit. Deck of cards heavy in my palm. The sun bleeds orange across the Texas horizon, and I know I have perhaps 20 minutes before the bell starts its nightly song. 20 minutes to decide whether I'll finally cross that threshold, or retreat to my truck like I have every evening for the past 3 weeks. The farmhouse looms before me, its windows dark and patient. During daylight hours, it's just another aging structure surrendering to the relentless prairie wind. But as shadows lengthen and the temperature drops, something shifts in its bones. The wood settles differently. The silence grows teeth. I shuffle the cards, the same faded deck she taught me to handle when I was 12, before I understood that her theatrical gestures masked something far more substantial than entertainment. The Queen of Hearts stares up at me, her painted smile worn thin by decades of fingers that knew secrets I'm still learning to fear. It started 6 months ago when the irrigation crew hit something 2 feet down near the east pasture. The foreman called it a time capsule, a rusted tin suitcase buried deliberately, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow kept moisture at bay for what the county assessor estimated to be 70 years. Inside, sepia photographs of faces I didn't recognize but somehow knew, handwritten letters in languages that sounded familiar when read aloud, and strips of fabric tied with knots that formed patterns my grandmother had sketched in her journals. The letters spoke of crossing, of leaving everything behind, of carrying only what could fit in careful hands. The photographs showed people who shared my grandmother's sharp cheekbones and deep-set eyes, generations of women who'd learned to read the future in cards and tea leaves, who'd whispered prayers in forgotten dialects while kneading bread and hanging laundry. My grandmother had been dead 8 years by then, but I swear I could smell her lavender soap when I opened that suitcase for the first time. The disturbances began the night I brought it to the house. Initially, I dismissed the small inconsistencies. A coffee cup that migrated from the kitchen counter to the dining room table while I showered. The grandfather clock chiming 13 instead of 12. Books reorganizing themselves by height rather than subject. These seemed like the natural settlement of an old house responding to new occupancy after months of emptiness. But then came the reflections. The first face appeared in the kitchen window while I was washing dishes. A woman with dark hair pulled back severely, eyes that held the weight of difficult decisions. She seemed to be standing just outside the glass, but when I looked through to the yard beyond, I saw only the blank white of heavy fog where none should exist. The reflection persisted even when I moved to different angles, as if she were somehow embedded in the glass itself rather than cast from any external source. Over the following weeks, more faces joined her. An elderly man with hands that bore the calluses of farm work. A young woman clutching a bundle that might have been cloth or might have been an infant. I never looked long enough to be certain. They never moved, never spoke, simply watched with expressions that suggested they were waiting for something I had yet to understand. The wind began shortly after. It would rise suddenly on still nights, rattling windows and doors with a rhythm that almost resembled knocking. But when I checked the weather stations, they reported calm conditions across the county. The sound seemed to originate from within the house itself, as if the walls were breathing irregularly. Objects developed their own gravitational preferences. I'd place my coffee on the side table and find it on the mantelpiece. Books fell open to specific pages, always passages about homecoming, about debts that pass between generations, about responsibilities inherited through blood rather than choice. The suitcase itself would migrate around the house despite my efforts to keep it secured in the bedroom closet. Each morning I'd discover it in a new location. The front hallway, the base of the stairs, once balanced precariously on the kitchen table as if someone had been examining its contents by lamplight. My grandmother's journal, which I'd found among her effects years earlier, began to make disturbing sense. Her careful notes about the ones who stayed and the price of passage read less like superstition and more like instruction manual. She'd written extensively about the responsibility that came with being the last keeper, about maintaining the boundary between what was and what wanted to be. I started avoiding the house during certain hours. The period between sunset and full darkness became particularly oppressive, as if the building were gathering itself for some nightly transformation. The air would thicken until each breath required conscious effort. Shadows would stretch in directions that defied the available light sources. And always, the sensation of being observed from multiple angles simultaneously. The priest my grandmother had known, the one who'd provided those discreet blessings, had died 3 years ago. His replacement was a younger man who spoke cheerfully about community outreach and social media presence, who seemed incapable of understanding that some problems required solutions older than seminary training. When I attempted to explain the situation, he offered pamphlets about grief counseling and suggested I might benefit from talking to someone about the stress of managing inherited property. So I learned to live with it. I established routines that seemed to minimize the disturbances. I kept the suitcase in the barn, as my grandmother had done. I avoided the house during the problematic hours. I carried the cards everywhere, shuffling them constantly like a rosary that required constant movement to maintain its protective qualities. But the pull grew stronger. Each evening I found myself drawn back to the porch, settling into her chair with the deck in my hands. The house would watch me through its dark windows, patient as a cat studying a mouse that hasn't yet realized it's being hunted. The faces in the glass would gather, their numbers increasing nightly, until every reflective surface showed crowds of patient observers, waiting for some signal I couldn't interpret. Tonight feels different. The cards seem heavier, their familiar weight concentrated in ways that make my palms sweat. The wind has been building since noon, though the weather service continues to report clear skies and minimal atmospheric disturbance. The suitcase appeared on the front porch this morning, despite being locked in the barn the night before, positioned directly in front of the door like an offering or a threat. The sun touches the horizon now, and I can feel the house preparing for its transformation. The windows begin to shimmer with movement that has nothing to do with the dying light. Shapes gather behind the glass. Not reflections this time, but forms with their own substance, their own purpose. They press against the barriers that separate their world from mine, and I understand finally that those barriers have been thinning since the day the irrigation crew disturbed their resting place. My grandmother's voice echoes in memory, teaching me the proper way to hold the cards, the correct shuffles for different types of readings. She'd always insisted that the cards were just tools, that the real power lay in knowing how to listen. But listen to what? And for how long had she been the sole guardian of whatever waited in that house? The bell gives its first tentative chime, though the sun hasn't fully set. This is new. This is acceleration. I rise from the chair, cards clutched against my chest like armor that might prove inadequate. The front door stands slightly ajar, though I remember closing it firmly this morning. Beyond the threshold, the house waits in darkness that seems deeper than the approaching night should allow. The faces in the windows have turned toward me now, their expressions shifting from patient observation to something approaching anticipation. They know what I'm beginning to suspect, that this isn't about supernatural harassment or inherited curses. This is about continuation, about a responsibility that passes through bloodlines like genetic memory, manifesting when the previous guardian can no longer maintain the watch. My grandmother hadn't been fighting them. She'd been working with them. The blessings, the relocated suitcase, the careful rituals with cards and chair and patient waiting, all of it designed not to banish but to manage, to maintain equilibrium between worlds that wanted desperately to collapse into each other. The bell chimes again, more insistent now. Inside the house, lights flicker in rooms I know contain no working fixtures. The suitcase creaks open though no wind stirs its vicinity. Papers rustle as if invisible hands were sorting through memories, searching for something specific, something that belongs to me. I take a step toward the door, then another. The cards seemed to pulse in my grip, warm against the evening chill. Behind me, my truck waits with its promise of escape, of returning to a world where houses behave predictably and reflections show only what stands before them. But ahead lies the completion of a contract I never signed, inherited through blood and geography, and the simple fact of being the last one left who remembers how to listen. The faces in the windows nod almost imperceptibly, their expressions shifting toward something that might be relief. They've been waiting so long for someone to take up the watch, to learn the proper rhythms of maintenance and protection. My grandmother managed it for 6 decades after her own grandmother's passing. Now it's my turn to discover what she really meant when she spoke of keeping the boundary. The door swings wider as I approach, darkness beyond it complete, except for the soft gleam of photographs scattered across what should be empty floor. I pause at the threshold, cards ready in my hands, and understand finally that crossing it means accepting a role I've been training for without knowing it. Every childhood summer spent learning to shuffle, to read the subtle messages in pasteboard faces, to recognize the difference between coincidence and pattern. The bell chimes a third time, and I step inside to meet whatever has been waiting patiently for my return. The door closes softly behind me, and outside, the porch chair rocks gently in wind that exists only here, in this place where memory and responsibility converge. The cards know what comes next, even if I don't. They've always known, ways. They remember everything. Story 11. The dashboard clicks twice every time now. 2 hollow taps, like knuckles on glass, followed by that smell. Wet earth under hot lights. The kind that makes your throat thick and your eyes water. It started 3 weeks ago, right after Oregon. I tell myself it's the heat expansion in the plastic, maybe a loose wire touching metal when the engine warms up. Cars make noises, old cars especially. Mine's pushing 200,000 miles, and the check engine light has been my constant companion for the better part of a year. But the timing bothers me. The precision, always twice, always followed by that smell. I was coming back from Mount Hood Trail, legs still burning from 20 miles of single track, bike strapped to the roof rack and gear scattered across the passenger seat. The Subaru had been running rough all week, hesitating at red lights, that familiar shudder when I pushed it past 60. But it got me to the trailhead and back, which was all I asked. The engine light flared bright orange just past Boring, that fitting little town that squats between Portland and the wilderness. Not the steady glow I'd grown accustomed to, but an angry pulse that matched my heartbeat. Then the temperature gauge swung hard right, steam wisping from under the hood. I coasted to the shoulder, muscle memory from a dozen similar breakdowns guiding me to a spot where the road widened. Gravel crunched under the tires as I pulled off the asphalt, coming to rest beside what looked like an abandoned property. A stone wall, if you could call it that. More like rocks piled waist-high without mortar, the kind of barrier that says, "keep out," without actually keeping anyone out. The property stretched back into Douglas firs, the main house barely visible through the trees. What caught my attention were the lights, purple, white, and clinical, glowing from what looked like a barn or warehouse in the back. Grow lights. I'd seen enough of them in college to recognize the distinct spectrum, that artificial sun that cannabis farmers use to coax their plants through Oregon's gray winters. Not my business. I had AA and cell service, 2 bars showing on my phone. I'd call for a tow, wait an hour, and be home before midnight. Simple breakdown, simple solution. That's when I heard the truck. The engine note was different from mine. Deeper, diesel probably, with the irregular rhythm of a vehicle that had seen better decades. It approached from behind, headlights washing over my rear window, bright enough to make me squint in the rearview mirror. I expected it to pass. Rural Oregon was full of trucks, and most drivers knew to give a broken-down car wide berth. Instead, it slowed, stopped. The headlights died. In the sudden darkness, I could see him walking toward my car, tall and lean like a fence post, moving with the unhurried gait of someone who belonged here. His shirt hung open over sun-darkened skin, overalls pushed down to his waist and tied there like an afterthought, work boots that had seen decades of use. Nothing threatening about him exactly, but something in his posture suggested this wasn't a coincidence. He didn't approach my window directly. Instead, he circled the car once, slow and deliberate, his eyes moving from my license plate to the bike on the roof, to the scattered trail mix and water bottles visible through the glass. When he completed his circuit, he stopped at my door and raised his hand. 2 knocks, knuckles on glass, deliberate and patient. I cracked the window 2 inches, enough to hear him but not enough to feel exposed. He stood there for a moment, looking not at me, but past me, toward the property with its hidden lights. "Next time," he said, voice flat as creek stones, "break down somewhere else." That was it. No explanation, no threat, no demand that I leave immediately. He walked back to his truck, leaned against the tailgate, and waited. The message was clear enough. My car started on the first try. I drove straight home, checking the rearview mirror more than necessary, but his truck never followed. The temperature gauge settled back to normal within miles, and the check engine light returned to its familiar steady glow. By the time I reached my apartment in southeast Portland, I'd almost convinced myself it was just one of those weird rural encounters. A property owner protecting his privacy, maybe worried about thieves or law enforcement. Almost convinced myself. The clicking started the next morning. 2 sharp taps from somewhere in the dashboard, followed by that smell. Wet earth and artificial light, humidity and growth, the dense air of a greenhouse in summer. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then faded like it had never been there. I told myself it was nothing. Cars develop quirks, old plastic contracts and expands. Smells linger in ventilation systems. I'd been in plenty of grow operations during my college years, back when Oregon's laws were more relaxed, and everyone knew someone with a medical card and a basement full of plants. The scent was probably just memory association triggered by stress. But it happened again the next day. And the next. Always while driving rural roads, always when I was alone. 2 clicks, then that smell, thick enough to taste. I started paying attention to patterns, trying to map the occurrences. It never happened in the city, never on interstates, never when I had passengers, only on the back roads, the 2-lane highways that wound through Oregon's endless forests. I began avoiding them. For a week, I stuck to main arteries. I-84 to work, Highway 26 to the coast. I-5 when I needed to go south. No problems, no clicks, no smells. My life returned to something resembling normal, and I started to relax. Then I had to take 18 to McMinnville for a client meeting. The clicks came at mile marker 34, right where the road curves around Willackenzie Creek. 2 taps, sharp and clear, followed by that greenhouse smell so strong I had to pull over and check if something was leaking in the car. I popped the hood, examined the engine bay, ran my hands along the interior surfaces. Nothing. The smell faded while I searched, leaving only the clean scent of forest air and my own growing paranoia. I started researching online, diving into forums dedicated to automotive mysteries and unexplained phenomena. I found dozens of similar stories. Sounds without sources, smells without origins, mechanical symptoms that defied diagnosis. Most of the responses were skeptical, offering practical explanations for impractical problems. But buried in the threads were other voices, people who described experiences uncomfortably similar to mine. A woman in Tennessee who heard carnival music from her radio after passing an abandoned amusement park. A man in Nevada whose car smelled like oranges every time he drove past a particular citrus grove, a grove that had been torn down 5 years earlier. A trucker who swore his CB picked up radio chatter from the 1960s, but only on a specific stretch of Interstate 40. All of them had one thing in common. The phenomena started after an encounter with something they couldn't quite explain. I began carrying a digital recorder in my car, hoping to capture evidence of the clicks. For 3 days, nothing happened. I started to think maybe the problem had resolved itself, that whatever neural pathway was generating these experiences had finally worn smooth. Then I had to drive to Hood River. The most direct route would have taken me past that property again, past the stone wall and the hidden lights. I chose a longer path instead, adding 40 minutes to my drive time. But Oregon's rural roads have a way of converging, and navigation apps don't always account for human psychology. I found myself on a familiar stretch of asphalt, approaching from the opposite direction this time. The property sat on my left now, the stone wall looking smaller from this angle but no less deliberate. The lights were off. It was mid-afternoon, full sun, but I could see the shape of buildings in the trees, structures that seemed larger than they had from the other side. The clicking started before I drew level with the driveway. 2 taps, perfectly timed, followed by that smell. But this time something else came with it. The sound of an engine, diesel, deep and irregular. In my rearview mirror, I could see a truck pulling onto the road behind me. It looked like the same vehicle from that night, though at this distance and angle it was hard to be certain. What I could see clearly was that it was maintaining exactly the same distance, matching my speed whether I accelerated or slowed down. When I turned off at the next intersection, it turned too. When I pulled into a gas station, it continued past, but I caught a glimpse of the driver through the windshield. Same lean frame, same sun-darkened skin, same unhurried posture. He was looking straight ahead, but I had the unshakable feeling he was watching me. I waited 20 minutes before leaving the gas station, long enough for any coincidental traffic to clear the area. The road was empty when I pulled back onto the asphalt, but the clicking started again within minutes. 2 taps, then that smell, stronger now, so thick I had to crack the windows to breathe. That's when I noticed the radio. Static had been bleeding through my usual stations all week, but I'd attributed it to atmospheric conditions or interference from nearby transmitters. Now, listening more carefully, I could hear something underneath the white noise. Not music or voices, but a rhythmic sound. Mechanical, like the distant operation of fans or pumps. I turned the volume up, trying to isolate the sound, but it faded as soon as I focused on it, like a shadow that disappears when you look directly at it. The smell lingered for the entire drive home. I started researching the property, diving into public records and tax assessments. The land was owned by a company I'd never heard of, registered to a post office box in a town that might not even exist. The structures weren't listed in building permits, and satellite images from online maps showed nothing but trees where I'd clearly seen buildings. I called the county planning office, pretending to be interested in purchasing adjacent land. The woman who answered was helpful but confused. According to her records, that section of road ran through a designated wilderness area. No structures, no development, no legal access for anything more substantial than hiking trails. I printed the maps and drove back there the next day, armed with a camera and a growing need to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined everything. The stone wall was exactly where I remembered it, but the property behind it looked different in daylight. Smaller. The buildings I'd glimpsed through the trees were harder to make out, shadows and suggestion rather than solid structures. I parked across the road and waited, camera ready. For 2 hours, nothing moved. No vehicles came or went. No lights appeared in the trees. The only sound was wind through the Douglas firs and the occasional car passing in either direction. Just as I was preparing to leave, I heard it. 2 taps. Not from my dashboard this time, but from somewhere outside the car. Distinct and deliberate, like knuckles on glass. I spun around, searching for the source, but the road was empty. The property showed no signs of activity. Even the wind had stilled, leaving only an oppressive silence that pressed against my eardrums. The smell came next, so strong it made my eyes water. Wet earth and artificial light, but underneath it something else, something organic and green, like plants growing too fast in unnatural conditions. I drove home with the windows down and the radio off, but I could still hear that mechanical rhythm underneath everything. Fans or pumps or something else entirely, working tirelessly in the growing darkness behind my eyes. That was a week ago. Since then, the experiences have intensified. The clicking happens every time I drive now, regardless of location. The smell lingers longer, seeping into my clothes and hair until even my apartment reeks of greenhouse humidity. I've started seeing that truck in my peripheral vision, always maintaining distance, always watching. Yesterday I found tire tracks in the gravel behind my building. Fresh tracks, too wide for my car, with the deep tread pattern of work tires. This morning, my landlord mentioned that someone had been asking about me, a tall man with sun-darkened skin who wanted to know about my lease agreement. I've stopped driving rural roads entirely, but it doesn't matter anymore. The clicking follows me everywhere now. 2 taps, regular as a heartbeat, reminding me that some distances can't be measured in miles. Tonight, I heard it while sitting in my living room, nowhere near my car. 2 distinct sounds from somewhere in the walls, followed by that greenhouse smell so thick I had to step outside for air. When I returned, the smell was gone, but something else had taken its place. The sound of diesel engines, distant but growing closer. I can hear them now, circling the building like wolves around a campfire. Soon, I think, there will be 2 knocks on my door. Knuckles on wood instead of glass, but the same patient rhythm, the same message. And this time, there won't be anywhere else to go. Story 12. The fluorescent lights in the help desk hummed with the persistence of industrial insects, casting their sickly pallor across banks of monitors that never slept. I'd grown accustomed to the 24/7 rhythm of our underground facility, where day and night blurred into an endless stream of emergency calls and system alerts. But I'd never grown accustomed to him. He sat 3 workstations down from mine, this quiet man from North Dakota, whose name badge read simply, R. Keaton. His fingers moved across his keyboard with methodical precision, handling network failures and server crashes with the same detached efficiency he brought to everything else. In the 6 months since his transfer, I'd maybe heard him speak a dozen complete sentences until the comments started. It began during our coffee break on a Tuesday that felt identical to every other Tuesday. The break room smelled of burnt coffee and disinfectant, its white walls reflecting the harsh overhead lighting that never dimmed. Keaton stood by the vending machine, studying the selection with unusual intensity. "When the alarm goes off," he said, his voice carrying that flat Midwest accent, "pretend it's not for you." I looked up from my styrofoam cup, waiting for context that never came. He fed quarters into the machine and selected a package of stale cookies, the mechanical whir echoing in the sterile space. When I asked what he meant, he was already walking away, leaving only the lingering scent of industrial soap and something else, something metallic that caught in the back of my throat. That afternoon at 2:17 p.m., the fire alarm shrieked through the building's ventilation system. The sound pierced through the constant hum of servers and air conditioning, setting my teeth on edge. Protocol demanded we evacuate, but Keaton remained seated, his eyes fixed on his monitor as if the alarm were nothing more than background static. The rest of us filed toward the exits while he continued typing, his silhouette motionless against the blue glow of his screen. Later, security discovered it was an unscheduled test, a malfunction in the system that triggered the alarm without warning. No evacuation had been necessary. Keaton never mentioned his comment again, but I found myself watching him with new attention during our shared shifts. The second incident came 3 weeks later. We stood waiting for the elevator, the mechanical room's constant drone filling the silence between us. The building's guts, pipes, ducts, and electrical conduits ran exposed along the ceiling, creating shadows that seemed to shift with each flicker of the aging fluorescence. "The elevator's going to stop between 5 and 6, Keaton said, pressing the call button with deliberate pressure. "Take the stairs." His voice carried that same matter-of-fact tone he used when explaining network topologies to frustrated users. No urgency, no concern, just information delivered like weather data. When I asked why, he stepped back from the elevator doors as they opened with a mechanical sigh. "I always take the stairs," he said, turning toward the stairwell entrance. I rode the elevator alone, watching the floor numbers climb in steady progression. Between the 5th and 6th floors, the car jerked to a sudden stop. The lights flickered once, twice, then settled into a dim emergency mode. The intercom crackled with static before the building engineer's voice filtered through, explaining that a team from the 7th floor was trapped between floors, and that service would resume shortly. I spent 43 minutes in that metal box, listening to the muffled sounds of rescue efforts above me. The air grew stale and warm, carrying the metallic taste of recycled oxygen and machinery oil. When they finally extracted me, Keaton was nowhere to be seen, though his workstation showed recent activity, timestamps indicating he'd handled 17 calls during my confinement. The pattern established itself with relentless consistency. Keaton would make these comments, never predictions, always statements framed in past tense despite referring to future events. His words carried the weight of lived experience, as if he'd already witnessed whatever he described. The maintenance tunnel would flood next Thursday. He mentioned it on Monday with the same tired certainty one might reserve for discussing yesterday's rain. The main server would crash during the midnight backup cycle. He mentioned this during our 3 a.m. coffee break, 12 hours before the first error logs appeared. I started keeping a notebook, documenting his comments alongside their eventual fulfillment. The correlation was absolute. Not a single statement failed to manifest exactly as described. But his delivery never changed. No satisfaction at being right, no surprise when events unfolded. Just that bone-deep exhaustion that seemed to permeate his entire being, as if anticipating the future had drained him of any capacity for surprise or emotion. The notebook grew thicker as autumn deepened into winter. The building's heating system struggled against the season, creating a constant battle between two warm offices and frigid corridors. Our underground facility seemed to exist in its own climate, regulated by machines that hummed and clicked with mechanical determination. Sometimes, late in the shift, I caught myself listening to these sounds with heightened awareness, wondering if they carried messages I wasn't equipped to decode. Keaton's predictions expanded beyond the workplace. During a particularly quiet Thursday night, he mentioned that the coffee shop on 5th Street would close permanently after a pipe burst in their basement. 2 days later, I drove past boarded windows and a handwritten sign explaining the sudden closure due to flooding damage, when the local news station would run a special report on municipal water pressure, which intersections would experience traffic light malfunctions. The specific day our department would receive new computer monitors, information that hadn't been announced to anyone. I found myself anticipating his comments with an anxiety that bordered on addiction. Each casual observation felt like a glimpse behind reality's curtain, revealing some fundamental truth about the nature of time and causation that my rational mind couldn't process. Yet Keaton himself seemed increasingly hollow, as if each fulfilled prediction drained something essential from him. The most unsettling incident came on a frigid December evening, when the snow had turned the parking lot into a treacherous maze of ice and slush. We stood in the break room, watching the weather through windows that reflected our pale faces against the darkness outside. The heating system had been running overtime, filling the air with the dry, metallic scent of overworked machinery. "When your stepfather calls about borrowing the drill," Keaton said, stirring sugar into his coffee with mechanical precision, "tell him the battery's dead." I laughed, actually laughed, because the suggestion was so absurd. My stepfather lived 3 states away and hadn't spoken to me in months. We'd never been close enough for casual tool borrowing, and the idea of him calling for any reason seemed unlikely at best. At 9:17 p.m., my phone rang. The caller ID showed my stepfather's number, and his voice carried that particular strain that accompanied home improvement emergencies. A kitchen cabinet had pulled loose from the wall, and he needed to drill new anchor points before morning. Could he borrow my cordless drill? His own had died earlier that day. I stood in the parking lot, snow crunching under my feet as his words echoed through the phone. The cold air burned my lungs, and I could taste the metallic edge that seemed to follow all of Keaton's fulfilled predictions. Without thinking, I told him exactly what Keaton had suggested, that my drill's battery was dead. The lie came easily, naturally, as if I'd rehearsed it. After hanging up, I sat in my car with the engine running, watching my breath fog the windows while trying to process what had just occurred. The drill sat in perfect working order in my apartment, its battery fully charged on the workbench. Yet I'd lied without hesitation, following Keaton's script like an actor who'd forgotten he was performing. When I returned to the building, Keaton was at his workstation, handling a server crisis with his usual methodical efficiency. He didn't acknowledge my return, didn't ask about the call, didn't show any sign that he'd orchestrated the evening's events. But in the reflection of his monitor, I caught a glimpse of something that might have been satisfaction or relief. I started keeping a separate notebook for the predictions I'd ignored, the suggestions I'd declined to follow. The pattern was disturbing. When I didn't take the alternate route Keaton suggested, I invariably encountered the construction delays he'd implied. When I ignored his comment about bringing an umbrella on a cloudless day, I found myself soaked in an unexpected downpour. The universe seemed to bend toward his observations with relentless precision, regardless of my participation. But the ignored predictions carried consequences beyond mere inconvenience. They accumulated like a debt that demanded payment with interest. The nights I disregarded his subtle warnings, I found myself alone in the parking garage afterward, listening to footsteps that echoed from empty concrete spaces. Fluorescent lights flickered in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. The parking garage became a particular source of dread. Its concrete walls absorbed sound in unsettling ways, creating dead zones of silence punctuated by mechanical noises that had no visible source. The lighting fixtures hummed with electrical irregularities that made them flicker in sequences that resembled Morse code, dots and dashes of illumination that my tired mind insisted were trying to communicate something urgent. During one particularly harrowing walk to my car, the garage's ventilation system began cycling in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. Each breath of processed air carried scents that shouldn't exist in that sterile environment. Earth, vegetation, and something organic that suggested growth in impossible places. The shadows cast by the overhead lights seemed to extend beyond their natural boundaries, reaching toward me with finger-like projections that withdrew whenever I looked directly at them. I started timing my departures to avoid being alone in the garage, but this strategy only highlighted how isolated our night shift had become. The building employed dozens of people during regular hours, but after midnight, only essential personnel remained. Security guards who patrolled distant sectors, maintenance crews who worked in mechanical spaces, and our small help desk team, managing the endless flow of technical emergencies. Keaton's predictions grew more personal, more invasive. He knew when my sister would call with news about her job interview. He anticipated the exact day my car's check engine light would illuminate. He mentioned conversations with neighbors I hadn't yet had, describing discussions about property lines and noise complaints that materialized days later with uncomfortable accuracy. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the supernatural knowledge itself, but Keaton's increasingly apparent exhaustion. He moved through our shared shifts like a man carrying invisible weight, his shoulders curved inward as if protecting himself from blows that only he could see. The lines around his eyes deepened weakly, and his hands developed a tremor that became noticeable when he typed. Sometimes I caught him staring at the monitors without seeing them, his focus directed at something beyond the screen's glow. I began researching his background, using company databases and online resources to piece together his history. Raymond Keaton, originally from Fargo, had worked in information technology for 15 years before transferring to our facility. His previous employers described him as competent but unremarkable, exactly the kind of steady professional who excelled in support roles without drawing attention. No gaps in employment, no disciplinary actions, no indication of the uncanny abilities I witnessed daily. His transfer request mentioned family considerations, but the personnel files contained no emergency contacts, no beneficiaries, no evidence of connections that would necessitate relocation. He'd simply appeared in our department 6 months ago, bringing his quiet efficiency and impossible knowledge of future events. I tried engaging him in conversation beyond his cryptic observations, attempting to understand the source of his insights. During slow periods between calls, I'd ask about his background, his interests, his reasons for working nights. His responses were polite but empty, delivering biographical information with the same detached tone he used for everything else. He'd grown up on a farm outside Fargo. He preferred working nights because of the reduced supervision. He found the constant variety of technical problems engaging. None of these details provided insight into his predictive abilities, and his manner discouraged deeper questioning. Conversations with Keaton felt like interviews with someone who'd rehearsed appropriate responses without investing any genuine thought in them. He was present but not engaged, helpful but not connected, a human-shaped absence that handled network emergencies with supernatural efficiency. The winter deepened, bringing ice storms that made the parking garage even more treacherous. The building's heating system struggled against the cold, creating temperature fluctuations that made some areas uncomfortably warm, while others remained frigid. Our underground facility seemed to exist in its own microclimate, regulated by machinery that responded to atmospheric pressures I couldn't detect. During one particularly brutal February night, when the wind howled through the building's mechanical spaces with sounds that resembled human voices, Keaton made his most personal prediction yet. "The investigation's going to start on Thursday," he said, standing by the coffee machine while outside snow accumulated against the windows in patterns that looked almost intentional. I asked what investigation, though part of me already suspected the answer would involve me somehow. Keaton added sugar to his coffee with movements that had become increasingly mechanical over the months, as if he were operating his own body remotely. "They're going to want to see your notebooks," he continued, stirring the liquid with precise clockwise motions. "The ones where you've been tracking everything." The coffee machine gurgled and hissed, filling the break room with sounds that seemed louder than necessary. I realized I'd never told anyone about the notebooks, never mentioned my documentation of his predictions. They remained hidden in my apartment, filled with timestamps and observations that would read like evidence of either supernatural events or advancing mental illness. "What kind of investigation?" I asked, though my voice came out smaller than intended. Keaton finished stirring his coffee and disposed of the plastic spoon with deliberate care. When he looked at me, his eyes held that same tired certainty that preceded all his revelations. "The kind that asks uncomfortable questions about productivity and psychological fitness for duty," he said. "The kind that reviews security footage and discovers patterns." He was right, of course. Thursday morning brought 2 investigators from corporate security, their questions probing but professional as they examined our department's recent performance metrics. They'd noticed irregularities in my behavior, timing patterns that suggested I was anticipating events before they occurred, response strategies that implied advanced knowledge of system failures. The investigation lasted 3 weeks, during which I maintained my regular schedule while knowing that cameras tracked my every movement and analysts scrutinized my every decision. The notebooks remained hidden, but their existence felt like a physical weight pressing against my consciousness. Keaton continued his normal routine, handling technical emergencies with undiminished efficiency while offering no additional predictions about the outcome. The most disturbing revelation came when I realized the investigators were asking the wrong questions. They focused on potential information leaks, unauthorized access to system logs, possible communication with outside parties who might benefit from advance warning of technical problems. They never considered the possibility that someone might simply know the future with supernatural accuracy. Their rational worldview couldn't accommodate the truth of what I'd witnessed, so they constructed alternative explanations that made sense within their understanding of causation and probability. I was either gathering intelligence through illicit means or suffering from delusions that created false patterns in random events. The investigation concluded without formal charges, but with recommendations for psychological evaluation and enhanced monitoring of my activities. I was placed on modified duty, restricted from handling critical system alerts, relegated to basic user support, while specialists reviewed my mental fitness for continued employment. Keaton's prediction proved accurate in every detail except one. He'd implied the investigation would discover my notebooks, but they remained hidden throughout the entire process. This discrepancy haunted me more than the fulfilled portions of his forecast. Had I somehow altered the timeline by concealing the evidence more carefully? Or had he known I would succeed in hiding them, and factored that knowledge into his prediction? Spring arrived late that year, bringing rain that drummed against the building's windows with rhythms that resembled coded messages. The parking garage's drainage system struggled with the seasonal runoff, creating puddles that reflected the fluorescent lights in patterns that seemed deliberately arranged. My modified duty assignment meant earlier departures, but the garage felt no less threatening during daylight hours. Keaton's predictions became less frequent as the investigation's aftermath settled into routine. When he did speak, his observations focused on minor workplace incidents, printer malfunctions, coffee machine maintenance, scheduling changes that affected other departments. His supernatural knowledge seemed to be narrowing its focus, as if the energy required to perceive distant events was becoming too costly to maintain. I noticed physical changes in him as well. His hair had developed gray streaks that hadn't existed months earlier, and his hands showed signs of premature aging that made them appear decades older than the rest of his body. He moved with increasing deliberation, as if each action required conscious effort to execute properly. Sometimes I caught him pausing mid-task, staring at his keyboard or monitor with the expression of someone trying to remember instructions for familiar procedures. The most unsettling change was in his eyes. They'd always been pale, but now they seemed almost translucent, as if prolonged exposure to future events had bleached them of their natural color. When he looked at me during our infrequent interactions, I felt like he was seeing through me to observe events that hadn't yet occurred, or had occurred in timelines I couldn't access. My psychological evaluation resulted in mandatory counseling sessions with Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a specialist in workplace stress disorders who operated from an office on the building's third floor. Her questions were gentle but persistent, probing for signs of paranoid thinking or delusional beliefs that might explain my behavioral irregularities. I found myself constructing carefully edited versions of recent events, describing workplace pressures and interpersonal difficulties without mentioning Keaton's supernatural abilities. Dr. Morrison nodded sympathetically while taking notes that would determine my professional future, her pen scratching across paper with sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the carpeted office. During our fourth session, she asked about my relationship with coworkers, particularly anyone who might have influenced my recent behavior patterns. The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to spring, and I realized Keaton had probably anticipated this conversation months earlier. Perhaps he'd even factored my responses into whatever calculations guided his predictions. I described him as a quiet colleague who kept to himself, emphasizing his professional competence while omitting any reference to his uncanny insights. Dr. Morrison made additional notes, asking follow-up questions about the nature of our interactions and whether I'd observed any unusual behavior on his part. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was protecting the person whose supernatural knowledge had triggered the investigation that now threatened my career. Yet I couldn't bring myself to expose him, partly from loyalty, but mostly from fear of what consequences might follow. If Keaton's abilities were real, then revealing them could set in motion events I wasn't prepared to handle. If they were products of my deteriorating mental state, then discussing them would confirm Dr. Morrison's worst suspicions about my psychological fitness. After 6 weeks of evaluation and counseling, I was cleared to return to full duty with quarterly monitoring requirements. The official report cited workplace stress and temporary adjustment difficulties, recommending continued therapy, but finding no evidence of serious psychological disorder. I returned to my regular station, 3 workspaces from Keaton, resuming the familiar routine of handling emergency calls while listening for his next impossible revelation. But something fundamental had changed in the dynamic between us. Keaton's predictions had saved me from consequences I couldn't have anticipated, guiding me through the investigation with minimal damage to my career. Yet this protection came with implications that disturbed me more than the supernatural knowledge itself. If he could foresee the investigation's outcome, what other future events was he observing? What role was I playing in scenarios I couldn't perceive? The notebooks remained hidden in my apartment, but their psychological weight had increased exponentially. They contained evidence of either miraculous abilities or advancing delusions, but I could no longer distinguish between these possibilities with confidence. Dr. Morrison's questions had planted seeds of doubt that grew during the long night shifts, making me question not just Keaton's nature but my own perceptions of reality. Summer brought changes to the building's environment that seemed to mirror my internal uncertainty. The air conditioning system developed irregularities that created temperature fluctuations throughout our facility, making some areas uncomfortably cold, while others became stifling. The fluorescent lights began flickering in patterns that followed no detectable schedule, casting intermittent shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Keaton adapted to these environmental changes with his characteristic indifference, continuing his work routine regardless of temperature or lighting conditions. But I noticed he'd begun wearing long sleeves even during the warmest periods, and his movements had acquired a fragility that suggested physical discomfort he was determined to conceal. One particularly oppressive August night, when the air conditioning had failed entirely, and our underground facility felt like a technological tomb, Keaton made his final prediction. "The power's going to fail completely next Friday at 3:23 a.m., he said, his voice barely audible above the struggling ventilation systems. "Emergency lighting will last 47 minutes. After that, we'll be in total darkness until the backup generators cycle." He stood by the window, though the glass showed only our reflected faces against the building's interior lighting. His reflection seemed somehow less substantial than mine, as if he were gradually fading from the visible spectrum. "What happens during the darkness?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. Keaton turned from the window, and in the harsh fluorescent lighting, his eyes appeared completely colorless. Not pale, but genuinely transparent, like windows into empty space. "That's when you'll understand what you've been documenting," he said. "That's when the choice becomes unavoidable." The following Friday arrived with mechanical inevitability. I spent the day preparing for the predicted power failure, ensuring all critical systems had proper backup procedures and that emergency equipment was readily accessible. My colleagues attributed these preparations to professional diligence, unaware that I was following instructions from someone who'd already witnessed the evening's events. At 3:22 a.m., I sat at my workstation watching the clock display count down the final seconds. Around me, the familiar sounds of the help desk continued, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, air conditioning humming through the building's ventilation system. Keaton worked at his station with mechanical precision, his fingers moving across the keyboard as if he were transcribing events rather than responding to them. At 3:23 a.m. exactly, the building's power grid failed with a sound like thunder contained within concrete walls. Emergency lighting activated immediately, casting everything in the red glow of battery-powered fixtures that would preserve critical functions for precisely 47 minutes. Then, as Keaton had predicted, we would be in total darkness. But in those 47 minutes of crimson illumination, I finally understood what he'd been trying to tell me all along. The notebooks I'd hidden weren't documentation of supernatural predictions. They were transcripts of conversations with a future version of myself, transmitted backward through time by methods I couldn't comprehend. Keaton wasn't predicting events. He was remembering them from a timeline he'd already experienced. The choice he'd mentioned became clear as the emergency lighting began to dim. I could continue forward into an uncertain future, accepting the consequences of events I couldn't control, or I could step backward into the familiar pattern of predetermined outcomes, joining him in the exhausted certainty of knowing everything that would happen next. As the lights finally died and absolute darkness claimed the building, I heard his voice one last time in the suffocating blackness. "Welcome to yesterday," he said, and I realized I was no longer sure which direction time was flowing. Story 13. The cabin felt wrong from the moment we stepped inside, though I couldn't articulate why. Perhaps it was the way the floorboards gave slightly under our weight, as if the wood remembered the pressure of different feet, heavier steps that had worn grooves into patterns we couldn't see. My wife busied herself unpacking while I stood in the doorway, breathing in air that tasted of cedar and something else. Something lived in, despite the park ranger's assurance that we were the first guests of the season. The Redwood National Park stretched beyond our windows like a cathedral of giants, their canopy so dense that afternoon light filtered down in scattered coins of gold. We'd booked this place for isolation, for the kind of silence that only comes when civilization feels like a distant memory. The cabin sat nestled between ancient trunks, connected to the world by a single gravel road that disappeared around a bend like a question mark. Everything appeared normal on the surface. The kitchen held the expected amenities. The bedroom smelled of fresh linens, and the bathroom gleamed with the sterile cleanliness of recent renovation. Yet as evening approached and shadows began pooling in corners, I found myself paying attention to details that shouldn't have mattered. The way door handles seemed to rest at different angles than I'd left them, how the bathroom light switch showed faint smudges in a pattern that suggested frequent use by fingers not quite the same size as mine. My wife suggested a walk before dinner, and we spent an hour wandering trails that seemed to watch us pass. The forest held its breath as we moved through it, and more than once I caught myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following at a respectful distance. But the path behind us remained empty, save for the occasional scatter of leaves that might have been disturbed by wind, or might have been something else entirely. When we returned, dusk had begun its slow conquest of the sky. My wife settled onto the deck with a book while I headed inside, suddenly aware of a pressing need that couldn't wait. The bathroom door closed behind me with a solid click, the kind of sound that suggests security and privacy. I turned the lock, feeling the mechanism engage with satisfaction. The moment arrived without warning. I was mid-process when the handle turned with deliberate slowness, not the quick jerk of someone testing a locked door, but the careful movement of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The door swung open perhaps 4 inches, just enough for a person to slip through sideways, and stayed there with the patience of someone waiting their turn. My voice cracked as I called for my wife, and her response drifted from the deck where I'd left her, too far away to have been responsible for what I was experiencing. No wind moved through the cabin. The air hung still and warm, holding the scent of pine and that underlying something I still couldn't identify. I reached out and pushed the door closed, listening to the lock click back into place. But the feeling remained, the certainty that someone stood just outside, not with malicious intent, but with the polite expectation of shared access. Like a house guest who knows the routine and waits for their turn at the facilities. After washing my hands with water that ran colder than it should have, I emerged to find my wife exactly where I'd left her, absorbed in her novel, and unaware of anything unusual. I considered telling her what had happened, but found myself oddly reluctant to put the experience into words. Instead, I mentioned that the door seemed to stick, and she made a non-committal sound without looking up from her page. Dinner passed without incident, though I found myself glancing toward the bathroom doorway more often than necessary. The space beyond remained dark and still, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it waited for something. We talked about our plans for the following day, about the hiking trails we wanted to explore, and the wildlife we hoped to observe. But underneath the normal rhythm of vacation conversation, something else hummed like electricity before a storm. Later, as we sat on the deck watching stars emerge between the branches, the bathroom light suddenly blazed to life. Both of us turned toward the windows, and after a moment of steady illumination, the light died. Then it flashed again, stayed bright for exactly the same duration, and went dark once more. My wife frowned and started to rise, but I found myself reaching out to stop her. Something about the timing felt familiar, though it took me a moment to place it. 2 flashes, each held for 3 seconds, the exact pattern we used at home when one of us needed the other's attention. A private signal we'd developed over years of marriage, meaningless to anyone else but clear as speech between us. Probably just old wiring, my wife said, settling back into her chair, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. I agreed aloud while my mind raced through possible explanations. Electrical problems seemed reasonable until I considered the precise timing, the deliberate spacing between flashes. Random failures didn't follow patterns, especially not patterns that held personal significance. That night, sleep came in fragments. Every creak of settling wood made me wonder if someone moved through rooms we thought were empty. The bathroom door, which we'd left open as we always did at home, seemed to frame a darkness deeper than the rest of the cabin. I found myself listening for sounds that shouldn't exist. The soft shuffle of feet on bathroom tiles, the whisper of fabric against a doorframe, the careful breathing of someone trying not to disturb sleeping guests. Around 3 in the morning, I woke with complete clarity to the sound of running water, not the aggressive rush of a faucet left on high, but the controlled flow of someone washing their hands with the same careful attention I'd used earlier. The sound continued for exactly the length of time it takes to be thorough, then stopped with the precise click of a handle being turned off. I lay still, waiting for additional sounds, footsteps leaving the bathroom, perhaps, or the creak of floorboards under unfamiliar weight. But silence returned as if nothing had happened, broken only by my wife's steady breathing beside me and the distant whisper of wind through redwood branches. Morning brought coffee and rational explanations, Old pipes explained night sounds. We agreed. Cabins in remote locations were notorious for settling noises and plumbing quirks. My wife seemed genuinely unbothered by the previous evening's light show, dismissing it as the kind of minor inconvenience that comes with rustic accommodations. But as the day progressed, I found myself cataloging small discrepancies that accumulated like snowflakes, individually insignificant, but collectively troubling. The bathroom towel hung at a different angle than I remembered leaving it. The toilet seat showed a slight shift in position. Most unsettling, the bar of soap appeared to have been used, not dramatically, but with the kind of wear that comes from careful, thorough washing. I mentioned none of this to my wife, who seemed determined to enjoy our getaway despite the cabin's peculiarities. We spent the afternoon exploring trails that led deeper into the forest, and for a few hours I managed to forget about bathroom doors and mysterious lights. The natural world around us felt solid and comprehensible in ways the cabin did not. But as evening approached and we made our way back along the gravel road, the feeling returned stronger than before. Someone waited for us, I became certain, not with hostility, but with the patient expectation of a regular resident whose routine had been disrupted by unexpected visitors. That second night, I made a decision that felt both foolish and necessary. Before bed, I left the bathroom door open by several inches and placed a towel on the floor to prevent it from swinging shut. If something or someone needed access to the space, I would provide it rather than force a confrontation neither of us seemed to want. My wife noticed the arrangement but said nothing, perhaps attributing it to my ongoing concerns about the sticky door mechanism. We went to bed with an unspoken agreement to ignore whatever might happen in the night, though I felt her tension in the careful way she arranged herself under the covers, leaving space between us that hadn't been there the previous evening. I didn't sleep so much as drift in and out of awareness, floating on the surface of consciousness like a leaf on dark water. In that liminal state, I became hyper-aware of every sound and movement in the cabin. The refrigerator's compressor cycling on and off, the settling of wood as night temperatures dropped, and underneath it all, something else. A presence moving with careful familiarity through spaces it knew better than we did. Sometime past midnight, I heard the soft whisper of the bathroom door being adjusted. Not closed, but shifted to a different angle with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much space they needed. Footsteps followed, barely audible but unmistakably deliberate, crossing bathroom tiles with the confidence of long practice. The sounds that came next were utterly, impossibly ordinary. Water running at moderate pressure, the quiet efficiency of someone attending to personal needs without waste or hurry, the careful replacement of items in their proper positions, and then, after an interval that suggested thorough hand-washing, the same whisper of the door being returned to its previous angle. I lay in the darkness afterward, listening to my heart pound while my wife's breathing remained steady and unchanged beside me. Whatever shared the cabin with us had completed its business and withdrawn, leaving behind only the faint scent of soap and the kind of lingering warmth that comes from recent occupation. Morning brought no dramatic revelations, no evidence of invasion or intrusion. The bathroom appeared exactly as we'd left it, down to the position of the towel on the floor and the angle of the partially open door. Yet the space felt different in ways that transcended the physical, as if it had been used with the kind of respect that comes from long familiarity. Over breakfast, my wife finally acknowledged what we'd both been trying to ignore. The cabin felt occupied in ways that went beyond our presence, she admitted, not threateningly, but as if we'd moved into a space already inhabited by someone who simply made room for additional guests without abandoning their own routines. We discussed leaving early, cutting short our planned week in favor of hotels with solid walls and predictable plumbing. But something held us back, perhaps curiosity, perhaps a strange sort of courtesy that matched what we seemed to be receiving. Whatever shared the cabin with us had shown remarkable politeness, after all. It waited for convenient moments, used resources carefully, and maintained the kind of cleanliness that suggested consideration for other occupants. By the third day, a routine had established itself. We went about our vacation activities during daylight hours, hiking trails and observing wildlife with the focused attention of people trying very hard not to think about what waited at home base. Evenings brought a careful dance of accommodation, with bathroom visits timed to avoid conflicts, and doors left strategically positioned to prevent awkward encounters. The strangeness of it all should have terrified us, but instead, it settled into something almost comfortable, like sharing a house with a particularly considerate roommate who kept different hours and preferred to remain unseen. We learned to work around each other's schedules with the kind of unspoken communication that develops between people who share limited space. Yet underneath the growing familiarity, questions multiplied like bacteria in warm water. Who or what maintained such careful boundaries while demonstrating intimate knowledge of the cabin's layout? How long had this arrangement existed, and how many previous guests had experienced similar courtesies without understanding what was happening? On our final morning, as we packed belongings that somehow felt less familiar than when we'd arrived, I found myself reluctant to leave. Not because I'd grown attached to the strangeness, but because departure meant returning to a world where such experiences couldn't be explained or integrated into normal understanding. The cabin had become a place where impossible things happened with impossible politeness, and abandoning it felt like closing a door on possibilities I wasn't ready to exclude. My wife finished packing first and carried bags to the car while I made a final circuit of the cabin, checking for forgotten items and saying what felt like goodbye to more than just a vacation rental. In the bathroom, I paused to straighten the towels and ensure the space looked ready for the next occupants, whoever they might be, whenever they might arrive. As I prepared to leave, the bathroom light flickered once, briefly, like a nod of acknowledgement or perhaps gratitude. I found myself nodding back before catching myself and wondering when I'd started treating the cabin as if it were alive and aware. The drive home passed in contemplative silence, both of us processing an experience that defied easy categorization. We'd encountered something that challenged basic assumptions about how the world worked, yet we'd been treated with unfailing courtesy throughout the process. Whatever inhabited the cabin had shown us a consideration that many human encounters lacked. Weeks later, as we settled back into familiar routines in our own home, I found myself paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. The way doors sometimes stood at different angles than I remembered, how items occasionally appeared in positions that suggested careful use followed by precise replacement, the soft sounds that came from other rooms when I knew my wife was elsewhere. Perhaps the cabin had taught us to notice what had always been there, waiting patiently for acknowledgement in the spaces between our certainties and fears. Or perhaps some things followed travelers home, bringing with them the courtesy of shadows and the polite persistence of the unseen. I never told my wife about my growing suspicions regarding our own house, just as she never mentioned the way she sometimes paused in doorways, listening to sounds that might have been settling wood or might have been something else entirely. Some experiences resist explanation even as they transform understanding, leaving us with questions that feel more valuable than answers. The bathroom door in our house doesn't stick the way the cabins did, but sometimes, in the quiet hours between night and morning, I hear it open with the soft courtesy of someone who knows how to share space without intrusion. And I find myself grateful for the lesson in coexistence we learned among the redwoods, where the impossible revealed itself as merely another form of politeness, waiting patiently for recognition in the shadows between what we know and what we cannot bear to acknowledge. Story 14. The lease was too good to be true, which should have been my first warning. A ground floor apartment in Milwaukee's historic Third Ward for $800 a month, the kind of deal that makes you wonder what previous tenants discovered that made them leave in such a hurry. I signed anyway. 3 weeks into October, with winter breathing down Lake Michigan's shore and my savings account looking as barren as the trees outside, I couldn't afford to be choosy. The building manager, a thin man with eyes that never quite met mine, handed over the keys with the enthusiasm of someone passing along a debt. He mentioned something about the heating system being a bit vocal and the previous tenant moving out rather suddenly, but the words felt rehearsed, like dialogue from a play he'd performed too many times. The apartment itself was unremarkable, a studio with hardwood floors that creaked in specific patterns, windows that faced the alley, and a bathroom door that wouldn't quite close flush. The kind of imperfections you overlook when you're desperate. I spent the first week settling in, arranging my few belongings, and getting used to the building's rhythm. Old buildings have their own language, the whisper of settling foundations, the groan of pipes expanding and contracting, the distant hum of elevator machinery. By day, these sounds felt familiar, almost comforting. By night, they became something else entirely. The first incident happened on a Tuesday. I'd been living there exactly 9 days when I heard them. 2 sets of footsteps moving through the hallway outside my door. Not unusual, except it was past 2 in the morning, and the footsteps weren't heading anywhere. They moved back and forth, a slow patrol that seemed to pause at each door. Then came the laughter. It started low, almost conversational, the kind of shared joke between friends. But there was something off about it. Something that made my skin crawl even as I tried to convince myself it was just late-night residents heading home from the bars. The laughter had an edge to it, a quality that suggested the joke was on someone else, someone who wasn't in on it. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to make out words, but heard only that strange laughter punctuated by the soft metallic sound of doorknobs being tested. Not forced or yanked, just turned slowly, deliberately, as if checking which doors might be unlocked. The testing moved closer, door by door, until I could hear them right outside mine. My hand found the deadbolt, ensuring it was locked, and I held my breath as the knob turned. Once, twice. A pause, then more laughter, but different now, muffled as if it were coming from inside a metal box. The footsteps moved on. I told myself it was nothing. Drunk college kids, maybe. Or new residents who hadn't yet learned proper apartment etiquette. But sleep didn't come easily that night, and when it did, it was filled with dreams of corridors that stretched longer than they should, populated by figures that cast no shadows. The second night, they returned. Same time, same pattern. The patrol began at the far end of the hallway and worked its way toward my door. This time I was ready. I positioned myself by the peephole, waiting for the moment they'd pass in front of it. But when the footsteps stopped outside my door, when the knob turned and that strange boxed laughter filled the air, the peephole showed only an empty hallway bathed in the sickly yellow light of the building's ancient fixtures. Empty, yet I could hear them so clearly, it felt like they were standing inches away. That's when I noticed something else. When they laughed outside my door, when that metallic quality overtook their voices, the sound seemed to be coming from above, from the ventilation grate mounted just over my door frame. I'd never paid much attention to it before, just another architectural detail in a building full of them. But now, staring up at it in the dim light filtering under my door, I could see that it wasn't quite straight. One corner hung lower than the others, creating a small gap between the grate and the ductwork behind it. The footsteps moved on, but the laughter lingered, echoing through the ductwork like voices in a tunnel. By the third night, I was prepared. I'd bought a heavy-duty flashlight from the hardware store down the street, the kind security guards carry, dense enough to serve as a weapon if necessary. Not that I was planning violence, but the weight of it in my hand provided a comfort I desperately needed. I positioned myself behind the door, flashlight ready, and waited. They came right on schedule. This time I could distinguish between them more clearly. One set of footsteps was heavier, more deliberate. The other had a slight shuffle to it, as if one foot didn't lift quite as high as the other. They moved through their routine with the precision of a ritual, testing doors, sharing their private jokes, working their way toward me. When they reached my door, when that familiar metallic laughter began, I made my decision. I climbed onto the wooden chair I'd positioned beneath the vent and examined the grate more closely. It was definitely askew, and behind it, the ductwork extended back into darkness that my flashlight couldn't penetrate. The laughter seemed to bounce off the metal walls, creating an echo that made it impossible to determine its true source. Using my fingers, I carefully adjusted the grate, aligning it properly with its mounting frame. The difference was immediate. The laughter became muffled, distant, as if a door had been closed somewhere deep in the building's mechanical heart. But it didn't stop. If anything, it seemed to continue longer than before, trailing off into something that might have been words, if I could just make them out. I climbed down from the chair and pressed my ear to the door again. The hallway was silent now, had been silent for several minutes, but that muffled laughter continued to emanate from somewhere above and behind me. I looked up at the now straight grate, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the building's temperamental heating system. The ductwork was carrying voices. But from where? Over the following days, I became obsessed with the building's layout. I studied the floor plans posted in the lobby, noting the position of each apartment, each utility closet, each access point. The ductwork, as far as I could determine, connected all the units in the building, a central heating and cooling system that snaked through walls and ceilings like the building's respiratory system. If someone were somehow inside those ducts, they could theoretically move throughout the entire structure unseen. But that was impossible. The ducts were narrow, designed for airflow, not human passage. Still, the thought lodged itself in my mind like a splinter, growing more uncomfortable with each passing hour. I started paying attention to my neighbors, trying to identify the source of the midnight laughter. The elderly woman in 2B who shuffled when she walked, but never seemed to leave her apartment after dark. The college students in 3A who played music too loud, but were usually passed out by midnight. The businessman in 1C who traveled constantly, and whose apartment often sat empty for weeks at a time. None of them fit the pattern. None of them could account for the voices that seemed to originate from within the building's bones, rather than its inhabited spaces. I began experimenting with the vent. Each night, I would wait for the laughter to begin, then adjust the grate in different ways. Leaving one corner loose made the sound sharp and immediate. Tightening it completely muffled the voices, but also seemed to trap them, causing them to echo longer and more intensely. There was a sweet spot, a particular angle where the grate was almost but not quite aligned, that made the laughter sound most human, most real. But real in what sense? Real as in originating from actual people moving through actual spaces, or real as in my mind was finally processing something that had always been there, waiting to be noticed. The distinction began to matter less as the nights wore on. What mattered was the routine, the preparation, the feeling of some small measure of control over forces I couldn't understand. Each evening, I would position my chair, check my flashlight, and wait for 2:30 in the morning when the footsteps would begin their patrol. They never varied their schedule, never skipped a night, never deviated from the pattern that had become as familiar to me as my own breathing. Test the doors, share the jokes, pause at my apartment where the laughter took on that distinctive metallic quality, then move on to complete their circuit. I started to recognize their preferences. Door 1A always made them laugh longest. 2C seemed to annoy them. Their testing was more aggressive there, their voices sharper. At 3B, they barely paused at all, as if that door held no interest for them. But mine was special. Mine was where the laughter changed, where it took on that hollow, echoing quality that suggested vast spaces hidden behind thin walls. Winter deepened, and the building's heating system became more vocal. Pipes banged with thermal expansion, radiators hissed and clanked, and the ductwork carried not just my midnight visitors, but a symphony of mechanical sounds that made it increasingly difficult to distinguish between the normal operations of an old building and something more purposeful. I found myself sleeping less, spending more time listening to the sounds around me. During the day, I would press my ear to walls, trying to map the pathways that connected my apartment to the rest of the building. I discovered that the bathroom shared a wall with the hallway, and sometimes I could hear conversations from neighboring units bleeding through the pipes. The kitchen backed up to a utility closet where the building's main electrical panel hummed constantly, but it was the living area, where the vent was mounted, that seemed to be the most acoustically connected to whatever network existed behind the walls. I started keeping a journal of sounds, not just the midnight visitors, but everything. The 6 a.m. garbage truck, the 3 p.m. school children in the courtyard, the 11 p.m. news from upstairs. I noted patterns, variations, anything that might help me understand the architecture of noise that surrounded me. The journal revealed something unexpected. My midnight visitors weren't the only sounds that originated from the ductwork. Throughout the day, I could occasionally hear whispers, movement, sounds that didn't correspond to any activity I could identify in the building. It was as if there were a parallel community living in the spaces between spaces, following their own schedules, pursuing their own purposes. This realization should have been terrifying. Instead, It felt almost comforting. I wasn't alone in noticing the anomalies. The building itself was host to activities that defied simple explanation, and my midnight visitors were just the most obvious manifestation of something larger and more complex. I began to think of them as neighbors. Strange neighbors, perhaps, but neighbors nonetheless. They had their routines, their preferences, their private jokes. They tested doors not out of malice, but out of some compulsion I couldn't understand. And they reserved their most interesting behavior for my apartment, which suggested I held some special significance in their world. The thought that they might be as aware of me as I was of them became impossible to ignore. When I adjusted the vent grate, their laughter changed. When I positioned myself behind the door, their testing became more deliberate. We were engaged in some form of communication, following rules neither of us had explicitly established, but both seemed to understand. One night in early December, I decided to test this theory. When they arrived at their usual time and began their usual routine, I waited until they reached my door. As the laughter started and the doorknob turned, I tapped gently on the door frame. 3 short taps, then a pause, then 3 more. The laughter stopped immediately. For a moment that stretched like hours, there was absolute silence. Then, from somewhere above and behind me, 3 taps echoed through the ductwork. A pause. 3 more taps. I responded with 2 long taps, followed by 1 short one. The pattern was returned exactly, bouncing through the metal pathways that connected my apartment to theirs. We continued this for several minutes, establishing a simple rhythm of call and response. Nothing complex, nothing that could be mistaken for language, but clear evidence of interaction. They were listening. They were responding. They were as curious about me as I was about them. When the exchange ended, they moved on to complete their circuit. But something had changed. Their footsteps seemed lighter, their laughter more animated. I had the distinct impression they were pleased with our interaction, that they had been waiting for me to acknowledge their presence just as I had been struggling to understand it. Sleep came easier that night than it had in weeks, but in the days that followed, I began to question what I had experienced. Had I really heard responses to my tapping, or had the building's acoustics simply created echoes that my desperate mind interpreted as communication? Were there really people moving through the ductwork, or was I projecting human characteristics onto the mechanical sounds of an aging building? The uncertainty gnawed at me more than the original mystery had. At least when I was simply observing and trying to understand, I could maintain some objective distance. But now I was participating, and participation implied acceptance of a reality I couldn't prove. I found myself avoiding the journal, avoiding the nightly routine, trying to return to a normal sleep schedule. But the building wouldn't let me forget. Even when I wore earplugs, even when I turned up the television to mask other sounds, I could feel the presence of my midnight visitors. They were there whether I acknowledged them or not, following their patterns, testing their doors, sharing their private jokes in the spaces between spaces. The weight of that realization was almost overwhelming. I wasn't dealing with an intermittent mystery that I could solve and move on from. I was sharing space with something permanent, something that had probably been there long before I arrived and would remain long after I left. The previous tenant's sudden departure began to make more sense, not because of fear, necessarily, but because of the exhausting nature of coexistence with the unknowable. Christmas approached, and the building grew quieter as residents traveled to visit family. My midnight visitors, however, maintained their schedule without variation. If anything, they seemed more active during the building's emptier periods, their laughter echoing more freely through hallways that carried fewer competing sounds. On Christmas Eve, I made a decision that surprised even me. When they arrived for their nightly routine, when they reached my door and began their familiar performance, I opened the door. The hallway was empty, completely, utterly empty. But the laughter continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stepped into the corridor and looked up at the vent grate that had become the focus of so much attention. It hung slightly askew again, despite my repeated adjustments, and from within the ductwork came the sound of movement. Not the random settling of metal, but purposeful motion. I stood there for several minutes, listening to sounds that had no visible source, watching shadows that moved independently of any light source I could identify. The building around me felt alive with activity that existed just beyond the threshold of perception, a parallel world that intersected with mine only at moments like this. When I finally retreated to my apartment and closed the door behind me, I realized I had crossed a line I could never uncross. I had sought proof and found it, but proof of what exactly remained unclear. Were my midnight visitors actual beings moving through actual spaces? Or was I experiencing some elaborate psychological phenomenon that felt indistinguishable from reality? The distinction no longer seemed important. What mattered was that I was no longer alone in the building. I shared the space with others who tested doors in the night, who laughed at private jokes, who responded to tapped messages with tapped replies. Others who moved through corridors I couldn't see but could sometimes hear, who lived in the spaces between spaces and whose presence had become as much a part of my daily routine as morning coffee or evening news. I still live in the apartment. The lease was too good to give up, and besides, where else would I find neighbors so consistent in their schedules, so respectful of boundaries even as they tested them nightly? We've developed our own rhythm, my midnight visitors and I. They continue their patrol, I continue my observations, and sometimes we exchange our simple tapped messages through the medium of the building's mechanical heart. The building manager still avoids eye contact when we pass in the lobby. Sometimes I catch him glancing up at the ceiling with an expression I recognize, the look of someone listening for sounds that shouldn't be there, but undeniably are. I wonder if he hears them too, if he's always heard them, if that's why he was so eager to hand over the keys and why previous tenants left so suddenly. But I'm not leaving. This is home now, and home includes the weight of footsteps that cast no shadows, the sound of laughter that emerges from metal throats, and the knowledge that in certain buildings, you share the corridors with residents who don't need to use the carpet. They have their own pathways, their own purposes, and their own ways of welcoming newcomers to the community. The vent grate hangs slightly askew again this morning. I'll straighten it tonight, and tonight it will mysteriously shift back to its preferred position. It's become our ritual, theirs and mine, a small acknowledgement of the space we share and the boundaries we've learned to respect. After all, good neighbors accommodate each other's habits, even when those habits involve moving through walls and laughing in frequencies that shouldn't exist, especially then.